Hey guys, tonight we're pushing open the creaking wooden gate of a medieval garden, and for a moment, it feels like you've stepped out of your own time and into another. The air is still, except for the faint flutter of moths against torchlight. The scent is a blend of damp earth, herbs rubbed underfoot, and something tangy, like onions but sharper. You're standing at the threshold of a world where every leaf, every root, and every flower meant survival. And let's be honest, if you tried to live for a year on the forgotten vegetables we're about to uncover, you probably wouldn't survive this. They're nourishing, yes, but some are bitter, others stubborn, and a few are borderline weird. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push the gate open and step inside. The garden is ringed with stone walls, their surfaces mottled with moss and small ferns. The monks, or maybe peasants who borrowed the design, planted these enclosures not only to keep thieves out, but also to shield their crops from the biting winds. The soil beneath your feet is dark, turned with wooden spades and richened with compost of straw, dung, and kitchen scraps. You can smell it, earthy and sour, the scent of fertility in an age before chemical fertilizer. The paths are narrow, lined with low borders of herbs, the kind you might mistake for weeds in a modern park. Costmary, lovage, and pennyroyal send up sharp fragrances when your cloak brushes past them. At night, it almost feels like the plants breathe back at you, their perfumes heavier in the cool air. Straight rows divide the plot, though not with the military precision of modern monocultures. Instead, you notice clusters, roots here, leafy greens there, tall stalks leaning against the walls, and a patch of beans twisting around rough stakes. Everything feels purposeful, arranged by season, usefulness, and superstition. Some plants are tucked into corners not for taste but for protection. Herbs that ward off miasmas, or so medieval minds believed. You crouch down near a patch of small, feathery leaves. The plant is skirret, a forgotten root vegetable that once sweetened banquets. Its leaves aren't flashy, but the monks treasured it for its starchy, sugary roots, so delicate they'd sometimes break in the soil. The sight of it here tells you that this isn't just a peasant's patch. This is a curated survival kit, balancing nourishment with luxury. But not all is cultivated refinement. You hear the scurry of something small, maybe a rat, maybe a hedgehog, rustling among the cabbages. And these aren't the neat, round cabbages you know. They're sprawling, loose-leaved things closer to kale. They look wild, as though they're constantly threatening to bolt back into weeds. Historians still argue whether cabbages were domesticated here independently or brought fully formed from Roman legacies. Either way, these shaggy greens fed entire households, boiled until soft, salted, and maybe spiced if fortune allowed. As you walk deeper, the moonlight glints off pots of water set out in corners. These serve as primitive irrigation reserves, and quietly as pest traps. Insects swarm to the reflection and drown. The gardeners knew what they were doing, even if they wrapped their knowledge in prayer and ritual. You lean over a raised bed and catch the faint white flowers of parsnip. Once, this root carried more weight than the potato ever would, sustaining medieval bodies through winter. Its sweetness deepens in the cold, a natural sugar factory beneath the soil. You imagine gnawing on one raw, crisp, earthy, but faintly sweet, almost like a carrot without the cheeriness of orange. In the corner, you see angelica towering above the other herbs. Its thick stems gleam pale in the moonlight, almost eerie. This was no ordinary foodstuff, but a sacred protector. Monks chewed it against plague breath. Peasants hung it over doorways. Cheeky thought. Imagine someone today waving angelica in the subway to ward off germs. You'd stare, sure, but you'd secretly wish it worked. The further you stroll, the more this garden feels like a catalog of forgotten allies. Ramsons, the wild garlic, unfurl their broad leaves, still pungent even at night. Fennel stalks arch gracefully, their seeds rattling in the breeze. Near the walls, medlars droop from small, knotted trees. These fruits are eaten only when rotten soft, a delicacy that most modern palates would refuse. Yet here they're prized, their flavor like spiced applesauce with a sly tang. The humblest section is where turnips swell under the soil. Small, round, and pale, they look unimpressive, but they're a workhorse. Turnips feed animals, armies, and families alike. You remember the old rhyme about famine. When turnips were the feast, you knew hard times had struck. And still, these roots were valued enough to merit space in every garden. You catch the faint buzz of bees near the border of herbs. Even in this quiet night stroll, you realize the monks or gardeners built not just a food supply, but an ecosystem. Every forgotten vegetable carried more than calories. It carried stories of famine and feast, superstition and survival. One quirky detail jumps out at you. In some medieval records, gardeners claimed to plant leeks in pairs, believing that one would grow strong and the other weak, a natural sacrifice to balance fortune. Imagine explaining that to a modern agricultural scientist. Oh yes, this is my decoy leek. You wander past the final rows and reach the far wall, fingertips brushing the rough stone, cool with dew. Behind you, the garden stretches like a mosaic of textures, spiky leaves, feathery herbs, thick stalks, creeping vines, all half hidden by shadows. And though you know potatoes, tomatoes, and bell peppers will one day redefine Europe's diets, right now, this patch feels complete. A whole cuisine hums quietly in the dirt. For tonight, you're not outside looking in. You're inside walking, smelling, tasting, and brushing against plants that history has almost erased. The forgotten vegetables surround you like old friends, waiting to tell their stories. You step past the parsnip patch, and now your eyes settle on a stand of leeks, slender stalks with their bluish-green leaves fanning out like a row of miniature banners. They rise from the soil as if they've been standing guard for centuries, which, in a sense, they have. Leeks are one of the most enduring vegetables in European gardens, holding a status somewhere between everyday kitchen fare and cultural emblem. You bend down, run your fingers along the waxy leaves, and you imagine pulling one up. Its white shaft is thick, streaked faintly with soil. In medieval Europe, leeks were eaten by nearly everyone, from peasants slurping them in broth to kings chewing them in more refined pottages. The vegetable was simple, sturdy, and versatile. And unlike more delicate greens that bolted or wilted, leeks stood in the garden through frost and wind. In fact, they were so common that in Wales they grew into a national symbol. Even today, soldiers of the Welsh Guards wear a leek on St. David's Day. Picture that: men in bright uniforms, serious faces, each crowned with a giant onion-like stalk. It sounds absurd, but back then it meant courage, protection, and identity. As you imagine biting into one raw, sharp, oniony, almost peppery, you wrinkle your nose. Not exactly bedtime snack material, but boiled long enough in broth, the leek softens, sweetens, and perfumes the entire pot. This was the magic. It could stretch out flavor when meat was scarce. A single leek transformed plain grains, or beans, into a comforting meal. It's no wonder medieval households grew them in abundance. There's a quirkier side to leeks too. Some records show leeks were tied to the idea of fertility and passion. A few oracles suggested that leeks, eaten in excess, might stir up lustful thoughts. Imagine some monk in the scriptorium, carefully copying that advice while trying not to think about the implications. Historians still argue whether this belief came from actual medicinal effects or just from the leeks, let's say, suggestive shape. Either way, the plant carried layers of meaning far beyond the dinner bowl. You hear the crunch of gravel as you move along the bed. The leeks aren't alone here. They grow alongside onions, shallots, and garlic, the whole allium family, strong enough to perfume a village. For peasants, this meant an affordable source of both flavor and medicine. A concoction of leeks boiled in milk was thought to cure coughs. Leek juice rubbed into the scalp supposedly prevented baldness. Not sure how well that worked, but hey, people kept trying. The pungency of leeks carried social baggage too. Garlic was often dismissed as the food of the poor, too smelly for polite company. Onions were tolerated in moderation, but leeks sat in a comfortable middle ground, hearty, flavorful, and socially acceptable across classes. They were democratic vegetables, bridging the table of the peasant and the feast of the noble. You crouch, and your knees press against the cool soil as you watch the moonlight strike the long leaves. In your mind's eye, you picture a medieval cook's pot, iron, suspended over a low fire, its broth bubbling with barley, peas, and chunks of leek. The cook tosses in a sprig of savory or thyme, maybe a pinch of saffron if the household could afford it. The fragrance fills the hall, masking the smells of damp straw and unwashed wool. People huddle closer, bowls in hand, eager for the warmth that only leek soup can bring. One curious detail from Chronicles: during certain festivals, townsfolk decorated themselves with leek garlands. Children carried them, women braided them into ribbons, and men wore them proudly. It was as if this common vegetable had climbed beyond mere sustenance into the realm of symbol, even play. And when you think about it, what other vegetable today carries such loyalty? Maybe pumpkins in October, but even then, they're more decoration than dinner. You step back from the leek patch, and you imagine the sheer monotony of eating them day after day. This was reality for many. Yet monotony in medieval diets was often a matter of survival. Flavor came in bursts, in little mercies, a leek softened in broth, a root roasted in embers. And in those moments, people weren't thinking about forgotten vegetables or historical debates. They were thinking, "This fills my belly. This keeps me alive another day." There's a faint whisper of wind across the leaves, making them sway like a silent choir. For a moment, you realize that these leeks, these ordinary stalks, carried empires, armies, and households through winters that would have broken weaker crops. They're the quiet survivors, standing upright through centuries, always ready to be pulled, chopped, and stirred into the next pot. And as you stand here in the moonlit patch, brushing your hand across the tops of forgotten alliums, you feel the blend of reverence and weariness that medieval people must have felt. Reverence for a plant that gave them strength, and weariness for the sameness of yet another leek-filled meal. Both truths live side by side, just like the stalks themselves, tall, plain, and enduring. Your footsteps crunch lightly over the path, and now you pause by a quieter corner of the garden. The stalks here are finer, less imposing than the leeks, but there's something intriguing about them. They look almost like a cluster of parsley gone wild, with feathery green tops and delicate umbels that catch the silver of moonlight. This is skirret, one of those vegetables that history misplaced, but once upon a time, it was a sweet prize of the medieval table. You crouch closer, tracing the soft leaves with your fingertips. Skirret is technically a root, though you'd never know by its modest above-ground presence. Beneath the soil hides a tangle of thin, finger-like roots, each pale and crisp, a secret stash of natural sugar. When cooked, those roots become tender, carrying a sweetness that startled diners who were used to the earthy bite of turnips or the mild bulk of parsnips. Some medieval accounts even call skirret the sugar root, which sounds more like a candy shop than a vegetable patch. Picture a banquet in a medieval hall, candles flickering, musicians strumming their lutes, a platter carried in with roasted meats and rich gravies. And on the side, not just turnips, not just cabbages, but golden-skinned skirret, maybe fried in butter or baked into a pie. Nobles loved the stuff because sweetness was rare. Honey was expensive, fruit was seasonal, and sugar, when it trickled in from distant lands, was reserved for medicine or display. So skirret, humble little root though it was, found itself elevated into luxury status. But there was a problem. Skirret roots are thin and delicate, easily broken when pulled from the ground. Gardeners often complained they snapped before they could be lifted whole. That fragility probably explains why skirret never made it to the big leagues of agriculture. Potatoes, centuries later, would outclass it in calories and toughness. Skirret required patience, dig carefully, trim neatly, and cook gently. In a world driven by survival, delicacy often lost. There's a quirkier tidbit about skirret too. Some old herbals claimed it acted as an aphrodisiac, provoking Venus. as the scribes delicately put it. Imagine the scene. A monk solemnly recording this tidbit, knowing full well that dinner in the refectory might suddenly feel awkward if the brethren ate too much skirret stew. Historians still argue whether this reputation came from its sugar content, a placebo effect, or just plain rumor. But the idea lingered, adding a playful edge to what otherwise looks like an unassuming root. You imagine pulling one up now, your hands dusty, the roots dangling like pale strings of beads. Raw, they'd be crunchy, faintly sweet, somewhere between carrot and chestnut. Roasted, they'd caramelize slightly, the sweetness deepening into something cozy. Boiled into pottage, they'd melt into the broth, lending a soft, honeyed undertone. No wonder cooks praise them in manuscripts, though modern taste buds hardly remember their name. In some gardens, skirret was planted not only for taste, but also as a marker of refinement. The very fact that it required care and attention made it desirable among the wealthy. Meanwhile, peasants might grow a little on the side, enjoying its sweetness when the seasons allowed. But skirret was never the backbone of a diet. It was the treat, the pleasant surprise in a world of harsher flavors. You stand and look across the bed, thinking of how quickly tastes shift. Skirret once crowned tables in royal feasts, and now most people wouldn't recognize it in a lineup. Culinary fashion is cruel that way. But walking through this medieval garden tonight, you feel the tug of nostalgia for something you never tasted, like a ghost flavor drifting through time. The breeze lifts again, carrying a faint earthy sweetness, as if the garden itself wants you to imagine the skirret roots baking slowly, giving off their caramel perfume. You picture yourself sitting cross-legged by the fire, a steaming bowl in your lap, spooning up broth rich with barley, herbs, and a hint of that forgotten sugar root. You smile at the thought, not bad for a vegetable history left behind. And as you brush the soil from your hands, moving deeper into the moonlit garden, you can't help but think, if someone offered you a roasted skirret root right now, crisp on the outside and tender at the center, you'd bite into it without hesitation. Forgotten? Yes. But in this moment, rediscovered. You stumble across a narrow strip of plants that smells like someone has just crushed a fistful of lemon and black pepper into the air. The leaves are ribbed and a little glossy, the stems sturdy, and the overall impression is bold without being flashy. This is Alexander's, an ancient herb you find growing by roadsides, garden edges, and occasionally in hedgerows. Practical locations for a plant that once played a surprisingly prominent role in medieval kitchens. You bend to sniff it. The scent is green and slightly citrusy, a bright counterpoint to the heavier, earthier aromas of roots and cabbages nearby. In the Middle Ages, Alexander's, also called Alisander or Alessandra, was widely eaten across northern Europe. It turned up in pottages and sauces, its young shoots boiled like asparagus, and its leaves chopped into salads. Peasants and nobles both knew it. A mainstream historical fact. Historical accounts show Alexander's appearing in herbals and household books from the 12th to the 16th centuries, recommended as both food and medicine. That breadth of use speaks to its utility. It was a multi-purpose garden plant that bridged cooking and cure. You take a tentative bite of a tender shoot. The texture is pleasing, fibrous enough to feel like substance, yet tender when properly cooked. The flavor is layered. Celery's backbone, a whisper of parsley freshness, and that lemony high note that lifts everything. If you're imagining Alexander's as parsley's older cousin who knows how to mix a proper cocktail, you're not far off. In a bowl of barley pottage, a handful of chopped Alexander's would brighten the whole pot, turning dull starch into something that almost smiles. There's a quirky tidbit you can't help but love. Some medieval writers recommended Alexander's as an antidote for the effects of wine. Eat it before drinking to avoid headaches. That sounds like primitive biohacking or polite excuse-making for overindulgence. Historians still argue whether such claims were based on actual pharmacological effects or just hopeful folklore. Either way, the advice made Alexander's a favored hair of the dog herb for those who enjoyed a tipple. As you rub a leaf between thumb and finger, the scent opens into a memory of coastal kitchens. Alexander's tolerates salty soils, So coastal communities prized its briny-leaning flavor, an herb that whispered of the sea without needing to waste precious salt. You imagine a cook on a bit of cliffside land, snipping Alexanders to lift a fish broth. The herb hints at the shore even if the pot itself is inland. Practicality met flavor. It was an edible shortcut to maritime taste. There's social history folded into its leaves too. Alexander's fall from culinary favor coincides with the rise of cultivated parsley and the gradual reconfiguration of kitchen gardens. Parsley's milder profile and easier, tidier cultivation made it preferable in urban settings, while trade and shifting tastes nudged cooks toward different seasonings. Over time, Alexanders drifted toward hedgerows and the mouths of older rural cooks. You've seen similar patterns, a once common ingredient receding because something cheaper, faster, or smoother takes its place. It's a small, slow kind of cultural amputation. You crouch and look closer at the stem. Young shoots, if blanched, take on a tender snap like spring asparagus. In a modern kitchen, you could use it as a parsley substitute, braise thicker stems with butter and a squeeze of lemon, or chop young leaves into a rustic green sauce. But be warned, if left too mature, it goes a touch bitter. The medieval trick was to harvest early, or use it in mixed dishes to temper sharpness. Another oddity, Alexander's was sometimes planted near doorways to keep witches away. Yes, really. Medieval superstition courted the practical. If a plant smelled good and sprouted near thresholds, it might as well guard against harm. Whether such horticultural wards actually convinced anyone is another matter. Scholars still argue whether practices like these were widespread superstition or localized folk belief. The hedgerows read like living libraries of custom and convenience, where the practical and the ritual rubbed shoulders. Thinking of cooking again, you imagine a small household where nothing went wasted. Alexanders could be chopped into pottages to mask inferior meat, mashed with bread and garlic into a paste for sharing, or braised as a vegetable side when meat was scant. You picture a refectory where lads and elders alike reached for bowls heavy with stew, the Alexanders cutting through the monotony like a bright comma. In these ways, flavor is not luxury but social glue, something that makes shared lean provisions feel generous. You also notice practical measures gardeners used to keep Alexanders through seasons. Roots stored in cool cellars under straw, leaves dried for winter pottages, and seeds passed between neighbors like small treasures. In some coastal towns, it was pickled with vinegar to keep its flavor year-round. The exchange of seed and recipe explains how certain plants survived in pockets while others vanished. At the patch's edge you find a shard of pottery with a trace of dried green paste. It could have held crushed Alexanders mixed with garlic and bread, an economical spread to stretch a little meat across many mouths. That domestic ingenuity is the quieter history. Flavor used as kindness during lean months. You linger a moment longer, thinking about decline and revival. Alexanders didn't vanish overnight. It drifted into hedgerows as fashions and farms evolved. Parsley's tidy leaves and ease of cultivation made it an urban favorite, while improved transport and a growing market for new spices nudged tastes away from older, hardier herbs. Historians still argue whether such shifts were driven more by changing palates, by agricultural labor demands, or by the simple economics of what sold at market. Now, oddly enough, food revivalists have started to look back. Chefs and foragers prize Alexanders for its boldness and history. Small-scale growers experiment with it in heirloom plots. There's a gentle justice to that. What was once ordinary becomes rare enough to be beloved, then expensive, then fashionable, and sometimes, if we're lucky, accessible again. Picture a smug little plate at a modern restaurant, microgreens, edible flowers, and why not, a sprig of Alexander sold back to you as authenticity. The irony makes you smile. You tuck a small stem into your pocket as a quiet souvenir, an act of tiny rebellion against culinary amnesia, and stand. The plant's scent lingers on your fingertips, citrus, celery, and something faintly of the sea. It's a small, stubborn flavor that reminds you the past is not a museum. It's in the edges, the margins, the plants people passed by when new tastes were marketed as better. Tonight, Alexander's gets a small revival in the quiet of your mind, which, in the grand scheme, is more than many forgotten vegetables can hope for. You step away, leaving the roadside patch to its slow business of seeding and growing, its scent hanging around your fingers like a gentle reminder. You drift toward another patch, where the plants are taller, more flamboyant in their growth, as if trying to outdo each other in reaching the moonlight. Their stalks stand straight with tufts of leaves like messy hair, and you notice the beginnings of flowers shaped like delicate starbursts. You've stumbled onto salsify and its darker cousin scorzonera, two roots with the curious nickname oyster plants. You kneel and brush back a bit of soil with your fingertips. The roots are long and thin, tapering like pale carrots, though scorzonera is darker, its skin almost black. They look unimpressive, maybe even scraggly. But beneath that rough exterior hides a secret. When cooked, they release a flavor faintly reminiscent of oysters. Not exactly a medieval surf and turf, but close enough to surprise palates that rarely encountered seafood inland. In the Middle Ages, salsify and scorzonera made their way into gardens from the Mediterranean, gradually climbing northward. A mainstream fact. Both roots were already documented in 16th century herbals, praised not only for their food value, but also as medicinal plants. They were believed to calm upset stomachs, refresh the body, and, according to some physicians, protect against plague. Yes, another plague remedy. At this point, you almost expect every plant in the garden to be labeled useful against plague. But the repetition shows how deeply fear shaped even dinner choices. You tug gently at a root, imagining the resistance of soil clinging tight. When roasted, the root turns soft, creamy, and faintly briny, as if the earth itself tried to imitate the sea. In lean times, that resemblance was more than novelty, it was luxury. Most peasants never tasted oysters. Only coastal dwellers or the nobility had access to them. So here was a root, grown in ordinary dirt, that whispered of tides and ships and feasts far away. The quirky side of scorzonera lies in its supposed power against venom. Some herbals claimed that if you ate scorzonera, you could withstand snakebite or even scorpion stings. The name itself, scorzonera, comes from the Italian scorzone, meaning viper. The idea was that eating the dark root created a sort of herbal shield against venom coursing through your veins. Historians still argue whether people actually believed it provided real immunity, or whether the association was more symbolic, a protective charm disguised as food. Either way, the lore added a hint of drama every time someone pulled the black root from the soil. You imagine a medieval cook preparing it. The roots, peeled carefully to avoid the sticky latex that seeps from the skin, are dropped into boiling water or fried gently in butter. The smell is nutty, soft, and slightly mineral, like roasted chestnuts with a whisper of the sea. A bowl of mashed scorzonera might appear on a noble's table alongside venison or boar, lending an air of refinement to the spread. And for peasants, if they grew it at all, it was another welcome source of starch and flavor, rare enough to feel like a treat. The moonlight gleams on the feathery tops of salsify. They sway in the breeze, almost ornamental. In fact, later gardeners sometimes grew them for beauty as much as for food. Their blossoms, pale lavender, star-like, earned them the nickname goatsbeard. Imagine walking into a medieval garden in early summer and seeing those blooms glowing against a backdrop of cabbages and beans. For a moment, food becomes decoration, and decoration becomes food. Another small curiosity. Salsify's sticky latex made it useful for odd little household tricks. Some records suggest it was applied to skin ailments, or even used like a primitive glue. It's the sort of detail that makes you chuckle. Imagine a medieval parent scolding a child. Don't play with your food, or paste your toys together with it. You reach out and pluck a stray leaf, rolling it between your fingers. The fragrance is faint, nothing like the boldness of garlic or the sharpness of leek. Yet hidden below is that root with its ocean-echoing taste. Forgotten vegetables often hide in plain sight, masquerading as weeds until someone bothers to dig. And when dug, they tell stories not just of flavor but of imagination, Because who first tasted scorzonera and thought, yes, this is just like an oyster? Your thoughts wander to modern times. Today, foodies and chefs occasionally resurrect these roots, treating them as gourmet rarities. But for centuries they simply lingered at the edges of gardens, useful but never dominant, intriguing but never essential. That's the melancholy of their story. Too unusual to be a staple, too fragile to rival potatoes, too odd to endure in memory. They became the wallflowers of the vegetable patch, waiting for someone curious enough to pull them from the soil. You stand, brushing dirt from your palms, and glance back at the twin rows. One pale, one dark. Salsify and scorzonera, siblings in obscurity. Their roots stretch into the soil, their flowers reach for the moon, and their legacy floats somewhere between medicine, myth, and dinner. They whisper of oysters to inland peasants, promise protection against serpents, and quietly glue together the scraps of daily life. You smile at the thought, vegetables with secret double lives. And with that thought lingering, you turn, the scent of roasted chestnut and phantom oyster trailing your imagination as you make your way toward the next patch. Your boots sink slightly into softer soil now, a section darker and loamier, worked carefully with spades and manure. You brush against feathery tops, thicker and taller than salsify, and there's a sweetness in the night air that seems to drift upward from the ground itself. You found the parsnip, one of the unsung heroes of medieval Europe, the root that kept people alive long before the potato marched onto the scene. You crouch, push aside the tops, and tug. The earth gives reluctantly, releasing a pale root, thick and tapered. It smells faintly nutty, earthy, with a subtle sweetness even before cooking. You imagine biting into it raw, crunchy like a carrot, but sharper with a peppery aftertaste. Yet roasted or boiled, it transforms, soft, golden, and honey-sweet, as though the cold earth coaxed sugar out of starch. A mainstream historical fact. Before the Columbian Exchange brought potatoes to Europe, parsnips and turnips were staple roots across the continent. They were calorie-dense, easy to grow, and tolerant of frost. Monks wrote about them in their garden plans, peasants depended on them to bulk out stews, and even nobles enjoyed them roasted with meats. Some medieval chronicles note that parsnips often stood in for grain during shortages, ground into flour like mash to stretch bread. You scrape the root with your nail and think about winter. Imagine the long, dark months, when the garden's greenery is gone, fruits are shriveled or preserved, and the only things standing between you and hunger are roots like this. Stored in cellars, parsnips grew sweeter as the frost kissed them. Entire villages survived because of them. They were not glamorous, not exotic, but essential. There's a quirky side too. In some regions, parsnips were brewed into beer or fermented into wine. Sweetness equaled fermentable sugar, and fermentable sugar equaled alcohol. A rustic parsnip ale wasn't uncommon, its flavor earthy and strong. Imagine villagers gathered around a rough-hewn table, mugs of parsnip brew in hand, laughing a little louder than usual. Not because it tasted great, but because it worked. Historians still argue whether parsnip ale was widespread or more of a local improvisation, but the evidence suggests enough people did it that the reputation stuck. You shift on your heels and glance at the rows stretching away. Parsnips didn't vanish entirely when potatoes arrived, but they were overshadowed. The potato was more reliable, more calorie-dense, easier to store, and yielded more food from less land. Over time, parsnips became a side dish rather than a staple, fading into obscurity. Forgotten not because they failed, but because they were replaced by something louder. But in the medieval garden, the parsnip reigned quietly. Its presence meant the difference between scarcity and satiety. Its mild sweetness made it versatile, roasted, mashed, boiled in broth, or mixed into pottages with beans and herbs. For nobles, the same sweetness elevated feasts. For peasants, it was survival food. And when famine struck, parsnips became life itself. One curious debate that lingers in scholarship is whether medieval references to pastinaca always meant parsnip, or sometimes carrot. Both looked similar before selective breeding gave carrots their modern orange hue. Some argue the two were often confused, their names swapped depending on region or scribe. Imagine a monk scribbling in Latin, "We planted pastinaca today," and centuries later, historians scratching their heads. Was that parsnip stew or carrot broth? The truth may be that it was both, roots blended by need, not taxonomy. You picture a pot bubbling on the hearth. Into it go chopped parsnips, beans from the last harvest, a scrap of bacon if fortune allows, herbs like savory or thyme, and perhaps a ladle of barley. The smell is sweet and hearty, filling the hall. Children wait with bowls, adults ladle carefully, and the warmth pushes back against the winter gloom. That was parsnip's gift, not glamour, not novelty, but endurance. You roll the root between your hands, dirt crumbling off like dust from a relic. Forgotten vegetables often carry a melancholy, but parsnips feel more like a whisper of gratitude. They were never flashy, never surrounded by superstitions about scorpions or witches. They were simply there, dependable, filling bowls when little else remained. If the leek was the soldier and the skirret the confection, then the parsnip was the quiet, steadfast farmer. Not celebrated, but indispensable. As you rise, you notice the frost starting to silver the garden wall, and the tops of the parsnips glisten faintly in the moonlight. They seem humble, yes, but also resilient, vegetables designed to be overlooked, yet ready to sustain anyone who bothered to dig. And maybe that's why walking here tonight feels so grounding. Among forgotten vegetables, parsnips remind you that survival sometimes hides in the plainest packages. You step forward, brushing frost from your sleeves, and suddenly the smell changes. It's sharper, less sweet, a faint bitterness that stings your tongue even without tasting. You've wandered into the wild patch where celery once grew in its original, unrefined form. The stalks are thin, ribbed, and darker green than the supermarket kind you might snack on with peanut butter. Their leaves, fringed and pointed, wave like little flags in the night breeze. You reach down and snap a stalk. Instead of the mild crunch you expect, this one bites back. Its bitterness is immediate, herbal, almost medicinal. You chew slowly, as if daring yourself to keep going, and the aftertaste lingers long and sharp, nothing like the watery crispness bred into modern varieties. Medieval celery wasn't the polite sidekick at a holiday platter. It was more like the friend who insists on telling you the truth, even when it stings. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Celery has a long and tangled history, stretching back to antiquity. The Greeks and Romans knew it well, but they didn't prize it as a vegetable. Instead, it was a ritual herb, often woven into crowns for the dead or used to honor athletes. By the Middle Ages, it still wasn't considered a daily food. Instead, it lived on the fringes of gardens, valued for its strong flavor, used sparingly in broths and pottages. It took centuries of selective cultivation before it mellowed into the sweet, pale stalks we know today. The quirky tidbit? Celery was once thought to stir up dangerous passions. Some medieval herbals hinted it might inflame lust, or even drive a person to madness if overconsumed. Imagine a monk scribbling a warning in the margin. Do not eat too much, lest the humors be disturbed. There are whispers that it was occasionally used as an aphrodisiac, slipped into dishes at feasts to spark merriment or scandal. Historians still argue whether these warnings were serious medical advice, based on humoral theory, or just clerical gossip amplified into legend. You step carefully between rows, brushing against feathery tops. The monks who tended cloister gardens sometimes grew celery not for food, but for remedies. Its seeds were prized for easing digestion, calming pain, or treating gout. Crushed into poultices, celery seed oil was said to cool fevers or drive out excess humors. You picture a medieval apothecary, shelves cluttered with jars, scooping a pinch of seeds into a pouch for a weary traveler. But for ordinary people, celery was something else entirely, a hint of flavor in a bland dish. Think of the endless medieval pottage, that stew of beans, roots, and grains. Drop in a handful of bitter celery leaves, and suddenly it sharpens. It becomes memorable, with an edge that cuts through monotony. You imagine peasants crouched by their hearths, scraping the bottom of a pot, grateful for the sting that made the meal feel alive. As the centuries rolled forward, gardeners experimented. They blanched the stalks by mounding soil around them, forcing pale, tender growth. They saved seeds from the least bitter plants, selecting generation by generation. Slowly, the celery softened. By the 17th century, it had turned into a fashionable vegetable, appearing in Italian and French cookery books. But here, in your midnight garden, it still snarls with its wildness, defiant and sharp. You pause to imagine a medieval feast. Rich meats, roasted capons, pies stuffed with prunes, and among the dishes, perhaps a relish of celery leaves, chopped with vinegar and herbs. A pungent side meant to awaken dulled palates. Not a star of the table, but a spark in the background, just as garlic or mustard might have been. And yet, for all its bitterness, celery carried an aura of mystery. It was a plant tied to both death and vitality. Laid on graves in Greek tradition, whispered about in medieval herbals as dangerous or healing, it seemed to embody contradiction. Historians still argue whether these associations influenced how often it appeared in medieval diets, or if people simply didn't care and ate it when hunger demanded. You snap another stalk, chew, and feel that old bitterness coat your mouth. It's not pleasant in the modern sense, but there's something invigorating about it, like plunging into cold water. It makes you alert. And maybe that's why medieval folk kept returning to it, despite its bite. Because bitterness meant strength, meant medicine, meant survival. As you move toward the next patch, the celery leaves brush your hands one last time. They feel wiry tough, not fragile like modern greens. They belong to a world where flavors weren't softened for comfort, but carried their full force. And you realize that in this garden of forgotten vegetables, celery wasn't waiting to be forgotten. It was simply waiting for us to catch up, to appreciate its wild honesty again. You wander past the sharp tang of celery and find yourself at the edge of a quieter, gentler patch of green. The air feels softer here, almost buttery in its calmness. Low, broad leaves spread across the ground, their surfaces slightly wrinkled, their undersides carrying the faintest silver sheen. This is good King Henry, sometimes called poor man's asparagus, sometimes Lincolnshire spinach. A plant that once grew in monastery plots and cottage gardens, now nearly forgotten. You crouch and pinch a leaf between your fingers. It feels thick, almost fleshy compared to lettuce or cabbage, but not tough. If you were to nibble it raw, the taste would be earthy, a little bitter, like spinach that's been asked to work overtime. Cook it down, though, and it mellows into something hearty, filling, and wholesome. Not luxurious, not delicate, but satisfying in the way that only survival food can be. Here's a mainstream fact. Good King Henry was a staple green in many medieval gardens. It was perennial, meaning once planted, it came back year after year without fuss. That made it invaluable in an age when most vegetables demanded constant resowing. It was known for centuries as a potherb, a plant that could be tossed into the ever-present stew pot, the pottage, to bulk it out and add vital nutrients. Monasteries valued it because it asked so little in return and fed so many. Now for the quirky tidbit. The plant wasn't only eaten as a spinach substitute. The tender young shoots, when blanched, were cut and eaten like asparagus. Imagine a peasant kneeling to harvest the first shoots of spring, carrying them home and roasting them over a hearth. Medieval cookbooks don't record it much. It was too common, too humble, but oral tradition suggests it was beloved as a seasonal treat. And in some regions, the seeds were ground into meal and mixed with flour, stretching bread for families that couldn't afford enough grain. But not everyone agreed on its virtues. Historians still argue whether good King Henry was truly widespread across Europe or more of a regional specialty. Some insist it flourished everywhere peasants settled, thriving in poor soils and worn patches near doorsteps. Others claim it was mostly found in England and parts of Central Europe, cherished there but barely noticed elsewhere. The debate lingers, fed by sparse records and shifting local names. You pluck a leaf, hold it to the moonlight, and see the fine veins branching like rivers. It's easy to imagine a medieval family leaning over their garden, cutting handfuls of these greens to feed a dozen mouths. In an era when famine was always just one bad harvest away, good King Henry was like a silent ally, never glamorous, never written into courtly menus, but always present. There's a certain humor in the plant's name, too. Why good King Henry? No one is quite sure. Some say it's a corruption of a German word for goosefoot, referencing the leaf's shape. Others believe it was named with a wink of irony, since it often grew untended, wild, near dung heaps and stables. Good King Henry was less noble ruler, more scruffy neighbor who hung around uninvited, but dependable all the same. You picture it in a medieval kitchen, a pot bubbling over fire, with beans, onions, perhaps a knuckle of salt pork if luck held. Into the pot went good King Henry leaves, chopped roughly, softening in the steam. The children would grumble, they always did, but eat eagerly, because this green was often the only vegetable on the table. Monks, too, bound by fasting rules, relied on it. In cloisters where meat was forbidden for long stretches, good King Henry gave their diets bulk and substance. Paired with eggs or cheese, it could become a meal worthy of a quiet feast. And in medical texts, it was praised for its ability to cleanse the blood, a catch-all phrase suggesting health, vigor, and balance of humors. You reach down and snap one of the thicker stems. The sound is fibrous, a little stubborn, but there's strength in it. This was a plant that mirrored the people who ate it, tough, rooted, resilient. The nobility might sneer at its humble taste, but to peasants and monks alike, it was nothing short of salvation. And yet, like so many of its companions, good King Henry slipped away. As spinach and asparagus became easier to cultivate and more fashionable, this perennial green was shoved aside. By the 19th century, it had nearly vanished from kitchen gardens. Today, it lingers in odd corners of old farmyards, a relic growing wild where once it was cherished. You rise slowly, brushing dirt from your palms, and glance back at the patch. The leaves glisten under the silver glow, quiet, unassuming, as if they're perfectly content to be forgotten. Still, there's a kind of nobility in their endurance. Good King Henry doesn't need our memory. It will come back each spring, whether we honor it or not. The garden air sharpens again, this time with a smell so familiar you almost feel your breath catching before you even find the plants. You follow the pungent trail until the silver moonlight reveals them, broad, lance-shaped leaves, gleaming with dew, clustered thick around the base. Their edges curl slightly, as if they're leaning into the night breeze. These are ramsons, wild garlic, the untamed cousin of the tidy bulbs you slice on your cutting board today. You reach down, crush a leaf between your fingers, and the scent bursts forth, raw, green, almost overwhelming. Garlic, yes, but fresher, wilder, with a grassy undertone that makes your mouth water. Imagine trudging through a medieval forest in spring and suddenly stumbling on a carpet of these plants. The air itself would reek of them, so strong that chroniclers wrote of entire valleys perfumed by wild garlic blossoms. Here's a mainstream fact. Ramsons were widely gathered across medieval Europe, a reliable wild food before cultivation standardized the garlic we know. Unlike onions or leeks, which needed deliberate planting, ramsons were a gift from the woods, free for anyone who knew where to look. For peasants and travelers, they were the perfect seasoning, portable, plentiful, and impossible to mistake once your nose caught hold of them. And here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval lore suggested ramsons could ward off evil spirits. The plant's aggressive smell wasn't just a kitchen aid, but a supernatural shield. Families hung bunches by doors, rubbed leaves on animals to keep away witches, or even carried bulbs as talismans. Garlic's protective aura was so deeply believed that some townsfolk feared neglecting it would invite misfortune. Historians still argue whether these practices were rooted in genuine folk religion or were simply exaggerated anecdotes repeated by suspicious clergy who disapproved of peasant superstitions. You pluck a bulb from the ground. It's smaller than modern garlic, slender, almost delicate. Yet in cooking, it worked the same magic. Tossed into a cauldron of beans or meat, ramsons transformed the flavor from bland to unforgettable. Even nobles used it, though sometimes disguised in sauces heavy with wine and herbs, the pungency tamed but still present. Imagine the feast hall, the platters of roast goose, and somewhere among the side dishes, a sauce that began with wild garlic gathered by some servant on a damp spring morning. But not everyone adored the scent. In monastic communities, rules often banned garlic before prayer, since its lingering aroma was considered disruptive to sacred spaces. Picture a monk chewing ramson leaves for lunch, only to find himself gently scolded by the abbot for smelling like a field. It was a plant that clung to you, whether you wanted it or not. Ramsons were also medicine, of course. Medieval herbalists praised them for cleansing the stomach, curing worms, and purifying the blood. Crushed into poultices, they were smeared onto wounds to ward off infection. Some manuscripts even hint at their use in love charms, though one suspects any kiss flavored with ramsons might have ruined the spell. You kneel lower, running your hands over the leaves. The ground here is damp, as wild garlic prefers, and you can almost hear a medieval family moving through the forest together, baskets in hand. Children tugging leaves too eagerly, mothers cautioning them to take only what they need, fathers laughing at the overpowering smell. Later, the leaves would be chopped into soups, mixed with cheese, or wrapped around fish before roasting in the embers. A wild harvest turned into a feast. Yet, like so many others, ramsons faded from daily use. As cultivated garlic became dominant, as kitchens demanded consistency rather than wild variation, the foraged plant fell into obscurity. Its season was short, its flavor too intense, its smell too clinging. People turned instead to bulbs they could store and tame, leaving ramsons to retreat back into the woods. You hold the crushed leaf under your nose one last time, letting its sting travel up into your sinuses, sharp enough to clear your head. Forgotten? Perhaps. But the forest never forgets. Every spring, the ramsons rise again, carpeting shady glades with their brilliant white flowers, filling the air with their unmistakable perfume. And anyone wandering those paths, centuries later, would still feel the medieval echo, the promise of food, medicine, and a little magical protection hidden in every pungent leaf. Your steps crunch softly on frosted soil as you leave behind the wild garlic, and almost at once you feel surrounded by taller, broader plants. Their leaves are heavy, dark, and tough, arching outward like giant green hands trying to block your way. No neat rows, no tidy heads, just a jungle of unruly foliage that seems to rise defiantly from the earth. This is cabbage before it was cabbage, the wild ancestors of the neat, round globes we toss into shopping baskets today. You tug at a leaf. It resists, fibrous and veined, with edges curled like the lip of a seashell. Bite into it raw and you'd wince, tough, bitter, sharp with mustardy oils. But boil it down, stew it long enough in broth, and it softens into something hearty, robust, and nourishing. That was the secret of these ancient cabbages. They were never elegant, never delicate, but they were strong. Here's a mainstream fact. In medieval Europe, cabbage existed mostly as loose-leaved forms, what we might today call kale or collards. The compact round head, bred for storage and convenience, only emerged much later through patient selection. In monastic gardens and village plots, cooks dealt instead with leafy thickets, cutting what they needed and leaving the rest to regrow. These greens were considered reliable pot herbs, endlessly useful in the daily stew. The quirky tidbit? Cabbage wasn't just food, it was also poultice. Medieval physicians recommended pressing boiled cabbage leaves against aching joints, swellings, or even headaches. Some even swore cabbage could cure drunkenness if eaten raw after too much wine. Picture a medieval reveler staggering out of a feast, handed a fistful of raw cabbage leaves by a well-meaning companion. Here, chew this. You'll feel better. Whether it worked or not, the story clings like the cabbage smell itself. Historians still argue whether cabbage was seen as peasant food or a respectable dish across classes. Some records show nobles enjoying stews thick with greens. Others suggest it was looked down upon as coarse fare. Likely, the answer shifts with time and place. In lean seasons, everyone ate cabbage. In times of plenty, it slipped back into the shadows of the feast table. You glance across the patch, imagining the garden in full summer. Thick stalks, broad leaves, the buzzing of bees moving among them. A medieval wife bends low, gathering leaves into her apron. She tosses them into a pot with barley and onions, creating a dish that's plain but nourishing. Beside her, a child gnaws at a half-cooked stem, wincing at the bitterness but chewing anyway. Survival had a taste, and this was it. But there was also strategy here. Cabbages thrived in poor soils, endured harsh weather, and came back again and again. When famine loomed, when fields failed, when grain harvests were thin, the cabbage patch stood as a lifeline. Its toughness, its sheer determination to grow where nothing else would, made it indispensable. You pluck another leaf and hold it up. The veins glow pale under the moonlight, like the skeleton of a leaf preserved in glass. You think about how much labor went into making this plant what it is today. Generations of gardeners selected the softer leaves, the tighter growth, until eventually the heads formed. It took centuries of human patience to transform the unruly ancestor into the supermarket cabbage. And yet here, in this garden of forgotten things, you're standing in the middle of its wilder, brasher youth. It's strange, isn't it, how the forgotten version feels more alive. Modern cabbages can sit, inert, in storage for weeks. But these wild cousins seem to breathe with the night air, leaves shifting as though restless. You can imagine medieval folk respecting them less as food than as living companions, difficult, stubborn, but dependable. You walk through the patch slowly, your hands brushing against the broad leaves. The smell lingers on your fingers, sharp and earthy. In the stillness, you picture a feast where nobles wrinkle their noses at cabbage, even as peasants celebrate it as their winter savior. One plant, two reputations, woven into the same society. That's the paradox of forgotten vegetables. They weren't forgotten because they failed, but because they were too ordinary, too constant, too bound to the lives of those who had no power to record them. As you step out of the patch, you glance back. The leaves look like green armor, bristling under moonlight. This was the cabbage of medieval Europe, untamed, unrefined, but fierce. You can almost hear it whispering as you leave. I was here before you, and I'll still be here long after. The air softens again as you wander away from the armored leaves of unruly cabbages. Ahead, you find a quieter corner, a patchwork of smaller plants sprawling close to the ground, their stems tender, their leaves varied in shape and shade. This is no monocrop. It's a mixture, a medieval medley of what were once called potherbs. Not one single vegetable, but a collective of greens thrown together into the pot. Sorrel, with its tart bite, purslane, smooth and lemony, mallow, mild and slippery when cooked. All companions in the endless rhythm of the medieval stew. You crouch and pluck a sorrel leaf first. It's arrow-shaped, glossy, and sharp to the tongue, bursting with acidity. A sourness that startles you awake, a plant designed to cut through bland grains and boiled beans. Next you pinch purslane, its small round leaves thick and succulent. Bite it, and it's almost refreshing, a crunch like cucumber in miniature. Then mallow, softer, fluffier leaves that once cooked turn gelatinous, thickening broth like a natural starch. Here's a mainstream fact. Medieval people didn't often eat salads the way we think of them today. Instead, they chopped these greens into pottage, that daily stew simmering in every household, rich or poor. Potherbs were essential, not as stars of the dish, but as background actors, adding vitamins, texture, and flavor. They were common enough to be overlooked. Yet without them, diets would have collapsed into monotony and deficiency. A quirky tidbit? Some medieval texts claimed purslane had magical powers. Protection against evil spirits if carried in your shoe, or even the ability to cool anger when eaten raw. Imagine a quarrel in a village tavern, two men glaring across the table, one chewing on purslane like a charm against rage. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were genuine folk traditions or colorful exaggerations written down by clerics fascinated with rustic superstitions. You picture the kitchen hearth again, smoke curling up the chimney. A pot hangs over the fire, barley bubbling at the bottom. Into it, someone tosses a handful of sorrel for sharpness, a scoop of mallow leaves to thicken, some purslane for freshness. No measurements, no recipes, just instinct and habit. The result isn't glamorous, but it's filling, nourishing, and surprisingly complex. This was medieval cooking, improvisation with whatever the garden or the roadside offered. You wander further into the patch and notice how these plants differ from the disciplined crops. They feel wild, half-tamed at best. Purslane especially looks like it might crawl out of the garden altogether, spreading in mats, thriving even in poor soil. That resilience was part of their charm. They were easy, forgiving, never failing in the way beans or wheat might. A family could always count on something edible if these potterbs were nearby. And yet, these greens were socially invisible. Nobles rarely wrote about them, preferring to record elaborate sauces or exotic spices. Monks listed them in their garden inventories, but only as minor notes, tucked between more serious crops like leeks and onions. They weren't forgotten because they were rare, but because they were too ordinary. The everyday ingredients never get glory, though they often hold everything together. You kneel and pluck another sorrel leaf, its tang making your mouth water instantly. Think of children sneaking these leaves from the garden, sucking them for their sourness like candy. A small thrill in a world with little sugar. Or think of a weary farmer on a hot day, chewing purslane as he works the field, quenching thirst with its juicy leaves. These little plants wove themselves into lives quietly, persistently, without ceremony. The scholarly debate extends further. Some argue that potterbs represented the true heart of medieval diets, far more than grains or meat, because they appeared in nearly every meal. Others insist they were secondary, a garnish on the plate of history. Perhaps the truth lies in between. Without grains, people starved. But without potterbs, people withered. Survival was never about one crop, but about the blend, the medley, the mix that turned scarcity into enough. You rise, brushing green flecks from your fingers, and glance back at the patch. It looks unremarkable, almost messy compared to neat rows of roots or cabbages. But in that scruffiness lies its power. Potterbs were resilience incarnate, sour, slimy, crunchy, bitter, fresh. They reminded medieval people that food didn't always need to be ordered or beautiful. It only needed to fill the pot and keep the family alive. And as the night wind rustles through the patch, you almost hear the whisper of those leaves, blending together in harmony, as if reminding you that history's true sustenance often hides in the forgotten details, in the small things tossed into the pot without thought but remembered by the body forever. The scent shifts again as you drift further down the moonlit path. The sweetness of potterbs fades, replaced by a sharpness that makes your nose twitch before you even see the plants. You've come to the patch of horseradish, its coarse, crinkled leaves jutting upward like banners, thick stems rising from the soil. This is no dainty herb. It's a root with bite, the kind that hides its fire underground until you dare to unleash it. You crouch, tug at a clump, and feel the resistance of a deep taproot. With effort, you pull free a long, gnarled white root streaked with brown soil. At first, it seems ordinary, like a pale carrot that's seen better days. But the moment you scrape the skin, an acrid sting blasts your sinuses, forcing tears to prick your eyes. That's horseradish, the plant that punishes before it rewards. Here's a mainstream fact. Horseradish was widely grown in medieval Europe, valued both as food and medicine. Its roots were grated and mixed into sauces for roasted meats, particularly fatty pork or beef, where the sharpness cut through the richness. It was also preserved in vinegar, a fiery condiment long before mustard became common. By the late Middle Ages, horseradish was firmly entrenched as both garden crop and kitchen staple across Central and Northern Europe. For a quirky tidbit, consider this. Some medieval herbalists swore horseradish could cure a toothache. The trick was to hold a piece of root against your gums until the pain numbed. Imagine it, the burn spreading, your eyes watering, your mouth aflame. But perhaps that searing distraction really did silence the tooth for a while. There are even accounts of grated horseradish rubbed into the scalp to stimulate hair growth. Whether it's sprouted hair or just a red, burning head, well, historians still argue whether people truly believed it worked or just tolerated the ritual in desperate hope. You sniff the torn root again and picture the medieval kitchen. A servant grates horseradish on a rough board, the air thick with fumes. Cooks cough and blink furiously, but they keep going because the Lord's roast goose won't taste right without it. In the hall, nobles dab the pungent paste onto their platters, the sting making them wince and laugh at once. Strong flavors were part of the spectacle, and horseradish was both seasoning and entertainment. For peasants, the root had a different role. It was tough, persistent, and grew even in poor soils. Families relied on it through winter, not just as flavor, but as medicine. Mixed into tonics, it was thought to warm the body, purge phlegm, and battle colds. And perhaps it did help, since its compounds clear sinuses as well as any modern remedy. You wander between the tall leaves, brushing them with your hands. They're coarse, with a scratchy texture, and the smell of roots still lingers in your nose. You imagine medieval farmers trudging home with bundles of horseradish strapped to their backs, roots bound with rope, the crop destined for both kitchen and apothecary. The scholarly debate lingers around where exactly horseradish originated. Some argue it was native to southern Europe, spreading northward with Roman cultivation. Others believe it grew wild in the colder regions and was domesticated later. The truth may be muddled, like the root itself, tangled, stubborn, resistant to being pinned down. But what matters is how deeply it embedded itself in culture. In some regions, horseradish roots were carried in spring rituals, symbols of strength and vitality. They were planted near stables to protect horses from illness, their fiery smell believed to ward off evil. The root that burned your tongue could just as easily burn away misfortune. You hold the gnarled piece to the moonlight, its pale skin catching silver gleams. Your eyes still sting from earlier, your throat raw from its ghost. Yet there's an exhilaration in it. Horseradish refuses to be subtle. It's the vegetable equivalent of a drumbeat in the quiet of the garden, demanding attention. As you leave the patch behind, the air clears, but the memory of that sting lingers. Horseradish doesn't slip away politely. It clings to you, reminding you that medieval gardens weren't only gentle havens. They were also home to plants that challenged, provoked, even punished. Forgotten? Maybe by name. But once you've felt its fire in your lungs, horseradish is impossible to truly forget. Your eyes are still watering faintly as you stumble from the horseradish patch into another corner of the garden. The scent softens here, earthier, rounder, almost comforting. In the dim moonlight, you notice rows upon rows of bulbous roots poking just above the soil. The leaves rise like green flags, crisp and broad, their veins shining silver under the night sky. You've come to the turnip beds, the humblest of the medieval vegetables, yet one of the most important. You crouch and tug gently at a plant. The soil yields easily, and a pale, rounded root comes free, its skin dusty purple fading into creamy white. It feels solid, heavy for its size, with a faint peppery smell that clings to your fingers. You wipe it on your tunic and imagine the millions of hands that once pulled turnips just like this, day after day, because lives literally depended on them. Here's the mainstream fact. In medieval Europe, turnips were a staple crop, especially for peasants and soldiers. They thrived in cool climates, grew quickly, and stored well through the winter. Long before potatoes arrived from the Americas, turnips were one of the roots that carried entire populations through the lean months. They weren't glamorous, but they were survival embodied. Now for the quirky tidbit. Turnips sometimes became weapons, not of war, but of ridicule. There are accounts of jesters pelting lazy actors or unpopular politicians with turnips instead of rotten tomatoes. The root was so common and cheap that it became shorthand for stupidity. Call someone a turnip head, and you weren't paying them a compliment. Yet that same insult shows how omnipresent the vegetable was. Everyone knew the shape, the taste, the dullness. It was the vegetable of the masses, as easy to mock as it was to mash. As you run your fingers across the firm root, you can almost hear the bubbling pots of medieval kitchens. Turnips simmer with barley in thick pottage, flavored with a little salted pork if fortune allowed. They're grated raw into salads in summer, or boiled, mashed, and pressed into pies during Lent. And when armies marched, turnips marched with them, crammed into sacks, roasted on spits, eaten raw on desperate days. Without turnips, Europe would have faced more hunger than it already did. Historians still argue whether turnips were truly loved or merely endured. The records show their ubiquity, but not the feelings of those who ate them day after day. Were peasants grateful for their reliability, or weary of their monotony? Did lords truly enjoy the sweeter young turnips served at feasts, or just tolerate them until venison arrived? The debate lingers because the turnip leaves behind few voices of its own, only the silent testimony of fields and kitchens. You wander between the rows, brushing the leaves with your hands. They're slightly rough, carrying the faint tang of mustard. In some villages, those greens were as important as the root itself. Boiled with beans or fried in fat, they stretched the family's diet. Nothing went to waste, not when hunger loomed at every winter door. Picture a bleak January, snow piled against the shutters, the hearth smoke thin because firewood is scarce. A pot simmers over the coals, and inside are turnips, nothing more. Children slurp the broth, mothers whisper prayers that spring will come soon, fathers chew slowly, thinking of fields to sow. In such moments, the turnip was not forgotten. It was the thread that kept life stitched together. And yet, in the noble gardens, the turnip was dressed in finery. It appeared glazed in honey, roasted with spices, even carved into decorative shapes for banquet displays. The same root that peasants gnawed raw in the field became a delicate garnish in the manor hall. This duality was part of its power, universal, adaptable, democratic in its reach. You bite into the raw turnip you pulled. The flavor is sharp, a little sweet, a little peppery. It crunches loudly in the stillness, echoing across centuries of mouths that have done the same. A peasant on a muddy road, a soldier in chainmail, a jester in a castle, all biting turnips, all tasting the same mix of sting and sweetness. As you finish the bite, you can't help but smile at the irony. The turnip, once mocked as dull and stupid, was in truth a clever survivor, shaping history from underground. Forgotten now, overshadowed by the glamorous potato and the versatile carrot, it once stood at the center of the medieval table. And here in this moonlit garden, it stands again, rows upon rows of stubborn, dependable roots, holding their ground. You leave the sturdy turnip beds behind, wiping the earthy dust from your palms, and follow a narrow path where the air suddenly grows sweeter, almost perfumed. The moonlight catches on tall, hollow stems rising above lush green leaves, and in the breeze you hear them rustle like whispers in a cloister. This is Angelica, the plant that carried a whiff of sanctity and mystery into medieval gardens. The stalks are thick, ridged like celery but taller, sometimes towering above a person's head. At the tips, globe-shaped umbels spread like fireworks frozen in mid-burst, each tiny flower glowing pale in the night. You brush the leaves with your hand and catch a scent that's both sharp and sugary, like fennel crossed with juniper. It feels less like food and more like incense, as though the plant wants to belong in a chapel rather than a kitchen. Here's the mainstream fact. Angelica was cultivated in medieval cloisters and monastery gardens, valued for both its flavor and its supposed protective powers. Monks candied its stems in honey or sugar if they had access to the rare crystals, turning it into a sweet preserve used for both medicine and luxury. Angelica was also brewed into tonics and cordials, and by the late Middle Ages, it became a star ingredient in herbal liqueurs crafted by monks, recipes that still echo in drinks like chartreuse and Benedictine today. For the quirky tidbit, consider this. Angelica was believed to ward off plague. Its very name was tied to the angelic, the divine. Folklore said that an angel appeared to a monk in a dream and revealed the plant as a cure for pestilence. During outbreaks, people chewed pieces of angelica root, believing the bitterness would drive the sickness away. Others wore it tied around their necks or hung it above doorways as a spiritual shield. It was medicine, amulet, and prayer all rolled into one fragrant stalk. Historians still argue whether Angelica's reputation as a plague fighter was more spiritual than medicinal. Some suggest its aromatic compounds did have mild antibacterial effects, helping in small ways. Others think it was purely symbolic. A plant with heavenly branding offered hope in hopeless times. The truth may lie somewhere in between, as it often does. You kneel and snap off a stem. It breaks with a fibrous crunch, releasing sap that smells almost like licorice. In a medieval kitchen, this stalk might be chopped into stews for a sweet, herbal lift, or steeped in vinegar to make an aromatic tonic. In wealthier households, candied angelica was served as a rare treat, its green glass stems sparkling on gilded platters. Imagine nobles nibbling pieces between courses, as if they were tasting a slice of heaven itself. But angelica wasn't confined to nobility. In rural villages, wise women gathered it from damp meadows, dried its roots, and brewed it into teas. It was given to children for stomach aches, to travelers against fatigue, to mothers during illness. And sometimes it was simply hung in bundles over doors, its scent drifting into the home, a promise of protection in a world that offered little. You let your fingers wander over the feathery leaves and picture a monastery courtyard. A monk in dark robes tends the angelica beds, careful with the soil, watering just enough. He pauses, touches the stem, murmurs a prayer. Perhaps he believes the plant is a gift from heaven itself, a silent ally against the darkness creeping through the land. In the still night, the angelica looks almost luminous, the umbels like halos glowing against the black sky. You can see why medieval people thought it belonged to another realm. Unlike turnips or horseradish, it doesn't scream survival or sting the senses. Instead, it hums with grace, offering sweetness and symbolism in equal measure. As you step away, the fragrance clings to your clothes, soft and lingering, like incense after Mass. The garden feels lighter for a moment, blessed by the angel's herb. And you realize that not every forgotten vegetable was merely fuel. Some, like angelica, fed the spirit as much as the body. You push onward, leaving angelica's sweet halo behind, and your path narrows into a small plot where stakes and trellises lean together like an improvised theater. Green tendrils writhe and twine, little pods dangle like dangling ornaments, and the air is threaded with a warm, vegetal scent, soft, nutty, and slightly grassy. This is the Pulse Corner. Peas and beans, the legumes that filled bellies, kept promises through fast days, and quietly held medieval communities together. You crouch among the rows. Pea vines wind up hazel poles, their leaves like tiny hands. Beans, broad, scarlet-seeded, pale, and speckled, climb and cling, flowers turn toward the moon. Some plants are bushy, others ramp like living ladders. You pluck a velvet-edged pea pod and pop it between your fingers. The peas inside are round and firm, sometimes a pale green, sometimes shot with age. You bite into one raw, a little burst of freshness, a soft sweetness that's almost shy. It's the kind of flavor that sits quietly in the mouth and insists on being noticed by the third spoonful. A mainstream historical fact: peas and beans were central to medieval diets across Europe. They were cheap to grow, rich in protein, and suitable for both fresh eating in summer and drying for winter storage. Monks cataloged varieties, household books listed recipes for peas pottage, and armies marched with sacks of dried pulses because they kept well and fed many. Without legumes, many medieval people would have lacked reliable protein through long months of meat scarcity or religious fasts. You close your eyes and imagine the steam from a pot of peas pottage rising into the rafters. The texture is thick, the aroma simple and reassuring. Pea barley, a smoked bone if the household could afford it, and a sprig of herb. The pottage is one of those dishes that sound dull on a menu, but are somehow irresistible at midnight when the hearth is low and the world outside is cold. It's a dish of endurance. You stir, you taste, you ladle, you pass bowls around, and everyone, old and young, takes a mouthful and mutters the small approval that says, yes, that will do. There's a quirky angle you wouldn't expect. Some medieval recipes advise beating peas with a stone or mashing them vigorously to turn them into a kind of paste used not only for eating, but for filling pastries, thickening soups, or even making faux cheeses. In the hands of a clever cook, dried beans could be soaked overnight, mashed, seasoned with herbs, and formed into patties that fried crisply on a cauldron's side. It was economical showmanship. With skill you could make the humblest pulse feel like a treat. You gather a handful of dried beans, kidney-shaped, dull and papery after their long cure. Run your fingers along their skins. Despite their austerity, they promise substance. A single bag of these could feed a family through a lean winter if rationed carefully. They were also portable. Soldiers and pilgrims prized them for this reason. Whenever you read a medieval travel diary, imagine a small pouch of dried pulses always at the ready, a tiny lifeline in the sack. Historians still argue whether peas or beans were more important in certain regions. Peas in northern climes where they thrived in cool weather, broad beans in southern and central zones where they yielded more reliably. Some areas favored vetches and other pulses that modern readers have largely forgotten. Others nurtured heirloom varieties that tasted markedly different from supermarket types. Local preference, soil type, and cultural habit all shaped the pulse pantry. And the debate among scholars is a lively one, full of regional pride and patchy records. In the kitchen, pulses were marvels of versatility. Fresh peas were celebrated in spring. Young pods were eaten whole. Older peas dried and stored. Beans could be hulled, split, or ground into flour. Peas pottage could be a coarse gruel for laborers or a refined puree for a noble's table, depending on the broth and adornment. Think of a manor where the lord picks a spoonful of thick pea mash, sprinkles a few fried herbs atop, and hands the bowl back down as a tiny triumph of taste over want. You pause to think about fasting rules. Medieval Christianity enforced days when meat was forbidden. Fish or vegetables took center stage. Pulses were a star of these fast days because they supplied protein without breaking the rules. A fasting monk might subsist on beans evening and morning, fortified by bread and ale. Pea and bean dishes became creative exercises in flavoring. Vinegars, oils, pickled herbs, and smoky fishes were combined to make fasting food feel generous. The ritual of fasting, with all its trims and constraints, transformed pulses from mere sustenance into a culinary puzzle. How to make austerity taste like abundance. There are odd folkloric uses too. In some villages, beans were used in divination. Dropped into pots to predict the weather, hidden under pillows to dream of future lovers, or scattered at thresholds to confuse malevolent spirits. The small beans were like beads of possibility, objects that traveled between the practical and the mythical. Such customs sit comfortably beside other garden charms you've met tonight. Remember Angelica hung against plague, or Ramson's rub to keep witches at bay. Each plant doubling as food and folklore. You tuck a couple of dried peas into your pocket like a talisman and savor the quiet wait. The tactile memory anchors the garden's lessons. The small things that you mash and stretch, that you soak and smoke, matter. In lean seasons, pulses were often the only thing that made a pot go far enough to feed a family. They were patient storehouses of nitrogen, enriching soils in the meantime. Farmers rotated legumes to keep their fields kind, an early sustainable practice that modern permaculturists now praise when they find historic precedent. A modern aside intrudes in a wry little way. Imagine a food influencer today staging a medieval revival with artfully photographed peas pottage and a hand-scribbled recipe, selling nostalgia to an audience that likes heirloom authenticity between sponsored ads. The irony would be delicious, peas returning as chic relics of poverty rebranded for the wealthy. Still, the reach of pulses from hearth to haute cuisine shows how taste migrates with context. You linger, imagining how pulses shaped daily routines. Women and children shelling peas together on porches, men loading sacks for market, and elders sorting seeds by size for next spring's sowing. The work was social. Small gestures stitched households into systems of survival. Peas pudding and thick peas porridge became travel food, cooled, sliced, and wrapped to feed laborers in the fields. In coastal kitchens, pulses met salted fish. Inland they paired with smoked meats or simply vinegar and herbs. Pulses moved beyond food into medicine and ritual. A warm bowl of split peas was thought to steady a fevered body. Bean hulls found odd uses in household remedies, and in some folkways, scattering beans warned off spirits or sluiced away bad luck. These practices sit beside Angelica's plague charms and Ramson's guardian scent. The garden is full of food that doubles as talisman. You stand and watch a neighbor's vine brushing yours. Seeds and stories pass hand to hand. Seeds are the currency of memory. Varieties saved, swapped, and sometimes lost. Farmers rotated legumes to restore soil. An early, practical crop rotation that kept fields fertile. So the land itself remembers the stewardship. You chew a fresh pea again, savoring its modest sweetness, and feel a continuity that is almost tender. Peas and beans are not glamorous heroes of cuisine. They are patient, pliant, and intimate with work. Without them, fasting would have been bleaker, fields poorer, and winter hunger far crueler. You leave the trellised rows to the night, the pods whispering like a distant village lullaby. The trellises of peas and beans fade into the dark as you follow a sandy track. The air shifts again, a damp tang rising, as though the ocean itself has exhaled into the garden. A faint roar of wind echoes in your imagination, gulls crying somewhere beyond the walls. Here, in the moonlight, squat mounds of leafy greens spread low to the ground, plants that don't quite belong to the inland earth. You've reached the beds of sea kale and other coastal harvests, vegetables that taste of salt and spray. The leaves are thick, ruffled, pale green tinged with bluish silver, almost waxy to the touch. They fold and curl like waves frozen mid-crest, and when you rub them between your fingers, they release a faint mineral scent, briny and unfamiliar. Sea kale was one of those strange delights of medieval Europe, gathered along rocky shores and sometimes cultivated in gardens, though it always carried the wild soul of the coast with it. Here's the mainstream fact. Sea kale, along with other shoreline vegetables like samphire, glasswort, and sea beet, formed part of the medieval diet in coastal communities. Long before railways or modern shipping, these salty greens gave much-needed variety to diets heavy on grains and roots. Monks in seaside monasteries grew them in cloister gardens, and fishermen's families gathered them from dunes and tidal pools. Their resilience made them valuable, plants that thrived where little else did, turning barren shores into pantries. And for the quirky tidbit, pickled samphire sometimes found its way to the tables of the wealthy, treasured not only for taste but for novelty. In certain markets, bundles of these salty greens were sold alongside fish, wrapped in rushes or seaweed to keep them fresh. Sailors chewed samphire for its vitamin C, unknowingly protecting themselves from scurvy centuries before the science was understood. Some stories even tell of sea kale roots roasted like chestnuts, served at feasts to surprise guests with their nutty flavor. Imagine the looks, expecting bread or meat, but receiving a coastal root roasted golden from the hearth. Historians still argue whether sea kale was truly cultivated in medieval gardens, or mostly foraged wild along the coasts. The records are patchy. Some herbals describe it clearly, others ignore it, and archaeology gives only hints. Perhaps it was a liminal plant, half domesticated, half wild, walking the line between shore and field. You crouch and snap off a stem. The flavor is peculiar, sharp and mineral, almost like biting into the sea itself. You imagine a fisherman's wife boiling these leaves in a blackened pot, stirring them into pottage, the salty bite lifting the blandness of barley. Or a monk in a seaside abbey blanching the shoots, serving them with oil on Fridays when meat was forbidden. Sea kale became a bridge between austerity and flavor, a reminder that even in scarcity, the earth, well, the sea, offered surprises. You picture the gathering. Families walking barefoot along wet sand, baskets swinging at their sides, eyes sharp for the right clusters of green. Children scrambling over rocks to snatch samphire from the cracks, fathers carrying bundles home, mothers washing them in cold water before laying them on the hearth. These harvests were not just about food but about rhythm, the rhythm of tides, of seasons, of the sea's generosity. The medieval imagination gave these plants curious symbolism too. Some believed their salty tang carried the sea's purifying essence, making them good for cleansing the body of humors. Others thought they strengthened eyesight or tempered melancholy. A strand of samphire might be chewed during prayer, or sea beet leaves pressed into wounds as poultices. Again, food and medicine blurred, as it so often did in the medieval garden. And here's a modern aside. Sea kale has been rediscovered by chefs in sleek city restaurants, where its shoots are served under silver cloches, drizzled with butter or truffle oil. The irony is rich. You can almost hear a medieval fisherman laugh at the idea of nobles paying fortunes for what his children once gnawed on raw as they played in tidal pools. Forgotten vegetables rarely stay forgotten forever. Sometimes they return wearing entirely new clothes. The moonlight makes the waxy leaves glow pale, like shells strewn across sand. You trail your hand over them, feeling their cool firmness, and for a moment it feels as though the sea itself has crept into the garden. These are the vegetables of liminality, of edges and boundaries, of life pulled from places where land and water wrestle. As you leave, the taste of salt lingers faintly on your tongue, as though you've kissed the sea goodnight. And you realize that medieval gardens weren't just bounded by walls. They stretched to shorelines, to estuaries, to the ragged fringes where people found food in unlikely places. Sea kale and its kin were reminders that survival often depends not on the obvious, but on the overlooked. The garden path bends, and suddenly the air feels warmer, heavier, as though you've stepped into a sun-trapped corner. Poles rise in crooked rows, tied together with twine, and from them dangle shapes that seem a little alien in the moonlight, long, pale gourds, bulbous squashes, and curling fruits that look more like serpents than supper. You've reached the parade of forgotten gourds, the climbing vegetables that once gave medieval gardens a touch of spectacle. The vines coil upward greedily, their tendrils wrapping poles, weaving nets across trellises. Leaves the size of your hands rustle overhead, and flowers still cling in pale yellow clusters. You glance up at one gourd hanging low, a bottle gourd, round at the base, narrow at the neck, its smooth surface gleaming like bone. Further down, a snake cucumber sprawls across the earth, coiling and curling as if it might slither off into the night. Here's the mainstream fact. Gourds were cultivated widely in medieval Europe, valued not only as food, but also as vessels and tools. The bottle gourd, once hollowed and dried, could be turned into a water flask, a storage jar, even a musical instrument. Snake cucumbers and their cousins were eaten as vegetables, boiled or stewed when young, or dried for later use. Though overshadowed later by pumpkins and other New World squashes, these Old World gourds were once everyday companions in fields and kitchens. Now for the quirky tidbit. Gourds sometimes doubled as props in medieval festivals and mischief. Hollowed bottle gourds were carved into masks or rattles, used in parades or by children playing tricks. Some were painted and hung in doorways as charms, believed to repel bad spirits with their odd, almost comical shapes. In certain villages, dried gourds were even strapped onto animals as makeshift bells, clattering and bobbing along as cows or goats wandered. Food, decoration, prank, and tool, all packed into one climbing plant. Historians still argue whether certain gourd varieties reached northern Europe through trade with the East, or whether they spread more slowly through Mediterranean influence. The records blur. Drawings in herbals sometimes misidentify species, and translations muddle names. Was a cucumber always a cucumber, or sometimes a snake gourd? The scholarly debates twist and wind like the vines themselves, tangled and hard to separate. You tug gently at one of the gourds hanging from a pole. The stem creaks but holds tight, fibrous and strong. In a medieval kitchen, this would be peeled, chopped, and boiled into pottage. Young gourds had a mild, watery flavor, soaking up herbs and broth, filling bellies without stealing the spotlight. In poorer households, they might be sliced thin and dried on racks for winter. Thin discs rehydrated later, not glamorous but nourishing. In noble halls, gourds sometimes made dramatic appearances. Imagine a cook carving out the soft interior, stuffing the hollow with spiced grains, minced meats, or fruits, then baking it whole. When the dish was sliced open, the filling spilled out like treasure from a chest. Feasts thrived on such showmanship, and gourds, with their hollow bellies, offered a stage. You run your hand along the smooth surface of another gourd, this one more pear-shaped. Its skin is cool and firm. You picture villagers drying these on rooftops, the shells turning hard and light, rattling faintly in the breeze. Once dried, the shell could be sawed into bowls, spoons, even ladles. Nothing wasted. Even when empty, the gourd remained useful. And then there's the snake cucumber, sprawled in the dirt at your feet. Its flesh when young was crisp, refreshing, a cousin to the modern cucumber. But left to grow long, it twisted into fantastical spirals, more spectacle than supper. Children no doubt teased each other with them, holding the curling fruits like staffs or serpents. Food with a sense of humor. It makes you wonder how many medieval laughs were born in gardens like this. A modern aside intrudes. Today, bottle gourds still appear in global kitchens, from Indian curries to African stews, from Chinese soups to Middle Eastern fritters. Yet in much of Europe, they've nearly vanished, remembered only by gardeners chasing heirloom seeds. It's a strange reversal, the gourd once common, then forgotten, now exotic again. You can almost imagine a medieval farmer smirking at modern chefs who treat them as delicacies. Above you, a breeze rustles through the broad leaves, making them flap like banners in a slow parade. The gourds sway gently on their cords, lantern-like, each one heavy with potential. They are vegetables of transformation. Food today, bowl tomorrow, rattle the next day. They remind you that in the medieval world, practicality was prized. Plants earned their keep by offering more than one gift. You step away, the image of dangling gourds etched in your mind, like a surreal carnival strung across the trellises. Forgotten? Yes, but only until you look closer. Then they reveal themselves as the versatile performers of the medieval garden, swinging, rattling, feeding, amusing, always useful, always waiting to surprise. The garden narrows into a lane bordered by tall, feathery stalks that sway like dancers in the night. The moonlight threads through them, catching on delicate leaves that look almost lace-like. You catch a whiff of something sweet yet sharp, and you know at once. You've stumbled into a patch of fennel, anise, and their fragrant kin. The air here is alive with perfume, the kind that clings to your hands long after you've brushed past. The stalks are sturdy, ribbed, and green, topped with golden umbels of tiny blossoms that glow faintly against the dark sky. If you pluck a leaf, it crumbles into wispy threads, and the scent blooms instantly, sweet, licorice-like, with a hint of pepper. You bite the leaf and the flavor hits you, crisp and bright, at once cooling and warming. You chew slowly, realizing that in medieval kitchens, this was a luxury of flavor in an otherwise heavy diet. Here's the mainstream fact. Fennel and anise were beloved in medieval Europe, used as vegetables, herbs, and medicine alike. Monks grew them in cloister gardens. Cooks added the seeds to breads and stews. Apothecaries sold them as remedies for digestion and bad breath. They were also chewed after meals as a primitive mouth freshener. Long before mints existed, a few fennel or anise seeds did the job. Roman influence had made fennel a household name, and its legacy stretched comfortably through the Middle Ages. For a quirky tidbit, fennel seeds were sometimes kept in church pews. Congregants chewed them quietly during long sermons, not only to stay awake, but to keep their stomachs from growling. Imagine a whole congregation with cheeks bulging slightly, crunching softly while the priest thundered on from the pulpit. Fennel is medieval popcorn. In other contexts, seeds of anise were baked into sweet biscuits, given to children at fairs and feasts, the licorice flavor leaving sticky smiles long into the evening. Historians still argue whether the cultivation of fennel in medieval northern Europe was widespread or limited mostly to monasteries and noble gardens. Some suggest its popularity as a vegetable, its crunchy stalks eaten raw or boiled, was more Mediterranean, while northern households favored it primarily as a seed and spice. The debate lingers, tangled in the difficulty of telling wild fennel from cultivated in fragmentary records. You break off a stalk, its surface ridged like celery. Raw, it snaps with a clean sound, and the taste floods your mouth with sweetness that feels strange for something green. Medieval cooks sometimes simmered fennel with fish, the flavors twining together. Others stewed the stalks in broths, letting them melt into a fragrant base. Seeds were sprinkled over roasted meats, baked into breads, even infused into wines. In wealthy houses, candied anise seeds were offered as a post-feast luxury, tiny pearls of sugar hiding bursts of flavor. But fennel wasn't only for feasting. It was a protective plant too. In some villages, fennel sprigs were hung over doors on Midsummer's Eve to ward off evil spirits. Others stuffed bunches into keyholes or laid them on windowsills. The sharp scent was thought to drive away witches, demons, or the wandering souls of the restless dead. You can imagine the sight. Bundles of fennel swaying in the night breeze, a fragrant shield against the dark. The plant carried medicinal weight as well. Mothers brewed fennel tea to soothe infants' colic. Travelers chewed seeds to ease nausea on rough journeys. Men claimed it improved eyesight if rubbed on the eyes, though perhaps that was wishful thinking. Anise, with its even sharper licorice punch, joined fennel in this dual role of seasoning and cure. Together, they blurred the line between kitchen and apothecary. You wander deeper into the patch, brushing against stalks that tower above your waist. The smell clings to your skin, strong enough to make you dizzy. It's easy to see why medieval herbalists wrote about fennel with reverence. They believed it made men lean and consumed their fat, a hopeful promise in an age when indulgence left its marks on wealthy bellies. Some even claimed it sharpened courage, an herb for knights as much as for cooks. A modern aside creeps in. Today, fennel bulbs sliced thin and tossed with citrus appear in glossy magazines as if they've been reinvented. But here in this moonlit medieval garden, you realize it's simply a revival. Peasants and monks knew these flavors well, chewing seeds to stay awake, hanging sprigs for protection, or stewing stalks into humble soups. Fennel was no novelty, only a long-forgotten friend. The feathery leaves brush your shoulders as you move through, whispering like soft voices. The garden feels lighter here, more playful, scented with sweetness rather than survival. And you understand that medieval life, harsh though it was, had its small pleasures, like the crunch of fennel stalks or the warm spice of anise seeds melting on the tongue. You leave the patch behind, licorice lingering on your breath, the faint sense that you've carried a charm with you. For fennel wasn't just flavor. It was protection, comfort, and a whisper of joy in an otherwise heavy world. The path dips slightly, and your feet crunch over damp soil scattered with fallen pods. At first you think they're wrinkled leaves, but when you stoop to pick one up, the shape becomes clear. A dried pod of broad beans, split open like a cracked smile. You've stumbled into a thicket of medieval beans and peas, their vines and stalks drooping with the weight of memory. The plants here don't boast the flamboyance of gourds or the perfume of fennel. They are sturdy, plain, practical, humble green soldiers that carried Europe through famine after famine. Thick stems rise knee-high, leaves broad and waxy, pods hanging heavy and blunt. You pluck one, squeeze, and hear the beans inside shift with a faint rattle, a sound that meant security to medieval ears. Here's the mainstream fact. Broad beans, also called fava beans, were a staple of medieval diets across Europe. Before the arrival of New World legumes, these were the backbone, boiled into pottage, mashed into pastes, dried and stored for lean months. Alongside peas, they offered protein where meat was scarce, becoming the poor man's steak long before soy or lentils made their appearances in global cuisine. Without them, entire populations would have starved in the hungry gap between winter and spring. Now for the quirky tidbit. Broad beans carried an odd reputation in folklore. Some medieval villagers believed the black markings on their flowers and pods were linked to death, and so avoided planting them near graves. In some regions, people thought the souls of the dead hid inside the beans themselves, whispering from within the pods. You can almost picture a peasant hesitating before biting into a stew, half convinced he might be chewing on an ancestor's spirit. Historians still argue whether the association between beans and death was superstition passed down from ancient Rome or a unique medieval invention. Some texts connect it to Pythagoras, who famously forbade his followers to eat beans, claiming they trapped souls. Others suggest the dark stigma was exaggerated later, romanticized by Renaissance writers looking for mystical patterns. Whatever the origin, the beans carried a baggage that was both practical and spooky. You squat down, splitting a pod with your fingers. The beans inside are plump, pale green, covered with a faint skin. Fresh, they would have been boiled and salted, eaten by hand on long summer evenings. Dried, they transformed into survival food, ground into flour or boiled into mush so thick a spoon could stand upright. In fact, many medieval households lived almost entirely on pottage made from beans and peas during the cold months. Imagine day after day of the same thick stew, flavored only with herbs if you were lucky, and a sprinkle of bacon fat if you were truly fortunate. In monasteries, beans were eaten in quiet refectories, sustaining monks through fasting days when meat was forbidden. The rule of Saint Benedict encouraged simple fare, and beans fit the bill. Filling, nourishing, humble. Records show that even when monasteries grew wealthy, beans remained on the table, an edible reminder of spiritual discipline. You glance toward a cluster of climbing vines nearby, field peas, their thin tendrils curling around stakes. Their pods are slimmer, rattling with small, hard seeds. Unlike the sweet peas you might imagine today, these were starchy and earthy, meant for drying. A pot of pea pottage was so iconic that even centuries later, peas porridge hot still echoes in nursery rhymes. Medieval children once sang that tune while scraping bowls clean. And here's a modern aside. You might grumble when leftovers last a day or two, but medieval families endured bean stew for weeks, recycling the pot daily, adding water, herbs, and scraps until the flavors merged into a timeless broth. Food historians even joke that pottage was less a meal and more a lifestyle, one that left its mark in the form of flatulence jokes scribbled in the margins of medieval manuscripts. Yes, monks had a sense of humor. As you rise, the plants shift in the breeze, their pods knocking together like wooden beads. The sound is strangely comforting, like a lullaby of survival. For peasants, beans and peas were more than food. They were life insurance. They meant you wouldn't starve before spring. They meant your children had a chance to see another year. And yet, they also carried shadows of superstition, ghost stories whispered over steaming bowls. You walk on, brushing the leaves, their waxy surfaces cool against your palms. Forgotten in modern kitchens, these legumes once dominated every medieval table, from castle halls to mud huts. They were plain, yes, but in their plainness, they carried the weight of entire civilizations. The air grows heavier again, and the ground underfoot shifts from neat soil to rough gravel strewn with pale, bulbous shapes. At first you think you've come upon a pile of stones, but the sharp tang rising into your nose tells you otherwise. This is the realm of leeks, onions, and garlic, the pungent backbone of medieval gardens, as unforgettable in breath as in taste. The stalks of leeks stand tall, their blue-green leaves fanning upward like blades of a living fence. Some bend under their own weight, revealing long white shafts half buried in the soil. Next to them, clumps of onions push fat globes above the earth, papery skins catching the faint light. Garlic sits close to the ground, clusters of leaves springing from hidden bulbs. Together, they form a pungent orchestra that could send vampires, or at least nosy neighbors, scurrying away. Here's the mainstream fact. Leeks, onions, and garlic were absolutely indispensable in medieval cooking. Without them, most stews would taste like bland mush. They were boiled with beans, roasted with meats, fried in butter, or crushed into sauces. They were cheap, reliable, and available almost everywhere, which made them staples for both peasants and nobles. In fact, the leek was so celebrated in Wales that it became a national symbol, worn in battle as a badge of pride. For a quirky tidbit, garlic wasn't just food, it was medieval bug spray. People rubbed garlic juice on skin to ward off lice and fleas, or hung braids of bulbs in stables to keep pests from livestock. There's even a record of soldiers stuffing cloves into boots, believing the smell would both toughen the skin and discourage infection. Imagine trudging around with your feet reeking like a soup pot, all in the name of health. Historians still argue whether medieval Europeans truly consumed garlic in enormous quantities, or whether its reputation has been exaggerated by later writers. Some suggest the strong smell was considered vulgar among elites, reserved instead for peasants and laborers. Yet noble recipe books occasionally slip it in, especially in sauces for fish, hinting that garlic's pungency crossed class lines more often than we assume. The debate hangs in the air, pungent as the bulbs themselves. You kneel and pull up a leek, soil clinging to its roots. The stalk is firm, its scent sharp yet sweet. In a medieval kitchen, this would have been chopped into rings and stewed with oats for a filling pottage. Onion skins, meanwhile, were boiled into broths that gave color as well as flavor. Garlic cloves, pounded with salt and herbs, turned into the medieval ancestor of aioli, a punchy sauce that could transform even the driest hunk of salted fish into something edible. But these plants weren't only about flavor. They carried symbolic and medicinal weight too. Monks brewed onion teas for coughs. Garlic was prescribed for everything from stomach worms to melancholy. Leeks were thought to cleanse the blood. Some superstitions painted them as protective charms. Garlic braids were hung in doorways to keep witches at bay. Onions were sliced in half and placed on windowsills to absorb illness from the sick. You can picture a worried parent hovering over a feverish child, placing a halved onion on the sill with the hope that the illness would seep out and vanish into the night air. And yet, the plant sometimes carried social baggage. Garlic breath was a punchline even then. Medieval satirists joked about peasants reeking of the stuff, offending delicate noses in church. You can almost hear the muttered complaints. Better to sit near the pigs than by that garlic muncher. Still, for all the jokes, no one could deny the power of these bulbs to turn bland grains into something worth eating. A modern aside slips in. Today, garlic enjoys cult status, roasted into sweetness, whipped into butter, celebrated on cooking shows. Onions and leeks are equally beloved, quietly forming the base of almost every cuisine. Yet back in this medieval garden, their role was far more primal, survival disguised as flavor. Without them, daily pottage would have been unbearable. The stalks sway as you stand, brushing against your arms, leaving a faint tang that clings stubbornly. These were the vegetables that rarely earned poetry or praise, but silently flavored nearly every meal. Forgotten? Hardly. They're simply so common now that their medieval heroism is easy to overlook. As you leave the patch, the smell trails with you, clinging to your clothes like an invisible souvenir. It's the scent of history itself, sharp, lingering, impossible to ignore. The path ahead feels softer, the soil loamy and faintly moist beneath your steps. A line of tall, feathery stalks rises on either side, their fronds delicate and fern-like, shimmering pale in the moonlight. You reach out and brush your fingers against them, and a faint earthy smell clings to your hand, subtle compared to the onions and garlic you've just left behind. This is the quiet corner of the garden where parsnips and skirrets grow, two roots now nearly forgotten, but once central to medieval plates. The parsnips stand taller, their leaves ragged, the roots swelling underground like pale, misshapen carrots. The skirrets are humbler, thin stalks barely reaching your knees, but below the surface lies a hidden treasure of many finger-sized roots sprouting from a single crown. You imagine a medieval gardener tugging them free, rinsing them in a bucket, and piling them onto a cart to take into town. Here's the mainstream fact. Parsnips were a major carbohydrate source before the potato ever arrived in Europe. Sweet when roasted, hearty when boiled, and filling in any form, they were eaten by rich and poor alike. In many regions, parsnips took the place of sugar before cane became widespread, mashed into sweet puddings, baked into pies, or even fermented into wines. Skirrets, though less remembered today, were also prized. Delicate roots that tasted somewhere between parsnip and carrot, considered so refined that they appeared on royal tables as well as peasant hearths. For the quirky tidbit, medieval cooks sometimes candied parsnips, boiling them in honey until they became chewy golden strips. These makeshift sweets were offered at festivals, a rustic cousin to candied fruit. Meanwhile, skirrets were so tender that they were sometimes eaten raw like snacks, pulled straight from the soil, and nibbled on the way home from the fields. One 15th century cookbook even suggests frying them in batter, an early version of vegetable tempura, centuries before anyone coined the term. Historians still argue whether skirrets were native to Europe or introduced from Asia via trade routes. Some records suggest they were common in medieval monasteries across Britain, while others argue they only became fashionable much later in noble gardens. The confusion arises from muddled plant names. Skirret, cicerut, and skirwort often overlap in manuscripts, leaving scholars to puzzle whether they refer to the same plant or to entirely different roots. You kneel, scrape at the soil, and uncover a parsnip, its pale root tapering like a crooked finger. Raw, it smells faintly sweet. Boiled into pottage, it would soften and melt, blending with leeks or beans into a warming winter staple. Roasted near a fire, its sugars caramelized, parsnips offered a sweetness peasants rarely tasted otherwise. For nobles, the same root might be paired with spices and cream, turned into custards that blurred the line between savory and dessert. Skirrets are trickier. You tug and the crown comes free with a cluster of slender white roots, tangled like strings on a harp. They're fiddly to clean, which may explain their decline once easier vegetables like potatoes became available. But in medieval kitchens, the effort was worth it. Boiled and buttered, skirrets were delicate and tender, praised in some texts as the most delicious of roots. It's a strange fate that they've nearly disappeared today, surviving only in seed-saving circles. The medicinal side of these roots was not overlooked. Parsnips were believed to warm the stomach and stimulate appetite. Some texts even hinted at aphrodisiac qualities, though whether that was hopeful exaggeration or actual observation is lost to history. Skirrets were described as comforting to the chest, prescribed for coughs and wheezing. You can imagine a mother pressing warm parsnip broth into a sick child's hands, hoping it carried healing as well as nourishment. And of course, there were superstitions. Some villagers believed parsnips harvested under a waning moon carried ill fortune, while those dug at dawn under a waxing moon promised health. Skirrets, with their many branching roots, were sometimes tied together and hung as charms against tangled dreams or restless sleep. Strange, yes, but when your world was shaped by seasons and shadows, a root could hold as much mystery as a star. A modern aside drifts in. Today, parsnips are often sidelined as a holiday oddity, roasted beside carrots once a year. Skirrets are almost completely absent, lurking only in heritage seed catalogs. Yet here in this medieval garden, they were center stage, sweet, hearty, and dependable. You almost want to reach down and roast one yourself, to taste what centuries of forgotten gardens once knew by heart. As you stand, the feathery leaves brush your arms like whispers, gentle and fleeting. These roots may be forgotten by modern tongues, but beneath the soil they still carry stories of hungry winters, festive feasts, and the quiet resilience of people who found sweetness where they could. The ground grows rougher, and your boots crunch over a scatter of dried stalks, stiffer than the leafy herbs or delicate roots you've passed so far. Here the plants rise tall and straight, their stems hollow, ridged, and almost woody. The scent is faint but musky, something between parsley and celery with a whisper of bitterness. You've stepped into the patch of angelica, lovage, and celery, the tall-stemmed herbs that stood like sentinels at the edges of medieval gardens. Their silhouettes loom in the moonlight. Angelica with its towering stalks topped by great domes of clustered blossoms, almost like pale fireworks frozen mid-burst. Lovage with broad, dark leaves shaped like oversized parsley. And celery, less familiar in its medieval form, more bitter and stringy than the crisp supermarket stalks you might imagine. Together, they give the impression of an herbal forest, small but proud. Here's the mainstream fact. These plants were staples of the medieval herb garden, prized both as flavoring and as medicine. Celery, though wilder and tougher then, was boiled into soups and stews, its leaves used much like parsley. Lovage carried a sharp, peppery note, lending depth to broths and sauces, while angelica was believed to protect against poison and plague, its stalks candied into a sweetmeat in wealthier kitchens. In short, these tall herbs were both seasoning and safeguard. For a quirky tidbit, Angelica was sometimes called the herb of angels, believed to have been revealed by an archangel as a defense against pestilence. Children in plague years were given necklaces of angelica root to chew, the idea being that its scent would purify the air they breathed. Lovage, on the other hand, found itself in a less heavenly role. Country folk tucked its leaves into shoes to disguise foot odor. Imagine trudging across muddy fields, your boots stuffed with what amounted to medieval deodorant. Historians still argue whether celery was widely cultivated in the Middle Ages, or if it lingered mostly in wild, marshy places, gathered by foragers rather than grown in neat rows. Some texts describe its presence in noble gardens, but others suggest it was too bitter for common use, only truly tamed into a vegetable centuries later. The ambiguity lingers, leaving modern scholars sniffing around medieval manuscripts like gardeners peering at half-faded labels. You kneel beside a stalk of lovage, its leaves jagged and aromatic. Pinching one between your fingers, the smell bursts forth, sharp, almost medicinal, like a cross between parsley and anise. In a medieval kitchen, it would have been chopped into pottage, used to freshen the heavy flavors of beans or salted fish. Wealthier cooks used it in sauces for roasted meats, believing its bold flavor cut through the richness. It even appeared in strong waters. Early herbal liqueurs distilled in monasteries and apothecaries. Angelica, towering above the others, carried a gentler sweetness. Its stems were peeled and eaten like a vegetable, or candied with honey for use as a festive treat. Apothecaries stocked its roots and seeds as a cure for everything from stomach cramps to melancholy. In fact, some herbals praised it so highly that you'd think it was a miracle plant capable of chasing away demons, plague, and heartbreak all in one. The truth, of course, is murkier. But then again, hope itself was often half the medicine. Celery, thinner and stringier, was less glamorous but dependable. Its seeds were ground as a spice, its leaves boiled into stews. Though its modern crunchy persona had not yet arrived, medieval cooks found ways to make it useful. And in medicine, celery was said to stir up desire, a polite medieval way of hinting at aphrodisiac qualities. You can imagine that conversation in a hushed corner of an apothecary. Perhaps a little celery for your problem? As you rise and look around, the tall stalks sway in the night breeze, their umbrella-like blossoms glowing faintly in the moonlight. You picture a monk in his cloister garden harvesting angelica at dawn, a cook chopping lovage into a bubbling pot, a peasant tucking celery seeds into his pocket as a charm. These were not vegetables for glamour or spectacle, but tall, sturdy guardians of the medieval table. A modern aside slips in. Today, candied angelica is so rare it feels exotic. Lovage is relegated to herb gardens known only to enthusiasts, and celery has reinvented itself entirely as a crisp, watery snack. Yet in this forgotten garden, their roles were broader, more vital. Food, cure, charm, and deodorant all wrapped into one. The stalks creak as you pass through, their shadows long and spindly against the garden wall. They feel almost like watchmen, plants that guarded not just the palate, but the health and hopes of medieval households. Forgotten, yes, but in their time, towering presences. The path turns stony beneath your feet, crunching with scattered pebbles as the soil grows thin and dry. The plants here look scraggly, not lush like the gourds or towering like angelica. Their stems are wiry, their leaves small and tough, as though they've learned to survive neglect. Yet as you brush past, an aroma stirs, a bitter, earthy perfume that catches in your throat. You've entered the patch of herbs once loved and loathed, rue, sorrel, and other sharp-tasting greens that balance the medieval palate with their sting. Rue is the first to catch your eye, its bluish-green leaves shaped like tiny teardrops, clustered on a woody stem. It looks harmless, but its smell, sharp, resinous, almost acrid, warns you away. Medieval gardeners valued it not for pleasure, but for power. Next to it, clumps of sorrel spread low, their arrow-shaped leaves bright and lemony to the tongue. Their sourness was a welcome spark in stews otherwise bland with grains and beans. Around them, other forgotten bitter greens huddle, ditander with its peppery burn, and cosmary, sometimes called ale-cost, used to flavor beer. Here's the mainstream fact. Bitter herbs like rue and sorrel were staples in medieval cooking and medicine. Sorrel was especially popular, its tang cutting through fatty meats or rich fish dishes. Rue, though less culinary, was considered medicinal, used to treat stomach troubles, headaches, and even poor eyesight. Bitter flavors had an important role in balancing humors, the medieval theory of health that sought harmony between hot, cold, wet, and dry. For a quirky tidbit, rue was thought to sharpen vision so much that artists sometimes rubbed it on their eyes, believing it would help them paint more clearly. Some monks, copying manuscripts late into the night, kept sprigs of rue at their desks, sniffing the pungent leaves as if clarity could be inhaled. Sorrel, meanwhile, was used in dyeing as much as in cooking. Its oxalic acid brightened fabrics, so you might find your supper greens also tinting your cloak. Historians still argue whether rue was genuinely consumed as a food in Europe or primarily a medicinal and symbolic plant. Recipes mentioning it are rare, and some suggest that its bitterness was tolerated only in tiny amounts or for ritual use. Others claim peasants used it freely, less concerned with delicate taste than with its strength as a tonic. The truth, tangled in incomplete records, leaves the plant standing in the half-light between dinner and apothecary. You pluck a sorrel leaf and chew. Immediately your mouth puckers at the sharp lemon tang. In a medieval kitchen, this flavor was precious. Without citrus fruits available in Northern Europe, sorrel was the closest thing to a lemon. It was stewed with fish, tossed into salads, or blended with herbs into green sauces that brightened roasted meats. Its sourness wasn't just taste, it was refreshment, a small escape from the heaviness of bread and beans. Rue, however, is less friendly. You rub its leaf between your fingers, and the smell clings stubbornly. Herbal texts praise it as a purifier, a ward against poison and plague. Mothers tucked sprigs into their children's clothing to repel lice. Some churches burned it in incense, its acrid smoke thought to cleanse the air of sin and sickness alike. Yet if you ate too much, rue could make you ill. Proof that medieval medicine often walked a fine line between healing and harm. Other sharp herbs crowd the edges here. Cosmary, with long, narrow leaves, carried a camphor-like scent and was used to flavor ale, hence its nickname ale-cost. It also doubled as a bookmark in prayer books, the smell keeping worshippers alert during long services. Ditander, less famous today, was a peppery herb that could scorch the tongue, standing in for black pepper when that expensive spice was out of reach. A modern aside flickers in. Today, bitterness is making a comeback. Craft beers, kale salads, tonic waters. Yet medieval cooks embraced it long before hipster bars did, weaving bitter greens into daily life out of necessity and belief. To them, these sharp tastes weren't fashionable curiosities. They were medicine, symbolism, and survival, all on a single stalk. As you leave the patch, the air feels clearer, your tongue tingling faintly with the sour echo of sorrel. Rue lingers on your fingertips, stubborn as old superstitions. These were the flavors that challenged, startled, and sometimes punished the eater. Yet they anchored medieval diets and rituals in ways we've almost forgotten. Your steps carry you beyond the neat rectangles of vegetables, toward the edges of the garden where the trees bend and twist into orchard form. Their trunks are gnarled, their branches heavy with fruits that look both familiar and strange. This is no polished supermarket aisle of shiny apples and bananas. Instead, you're confronted by fruits that medieval people once prized, though today you might not even recognize them. You reach up and pluck a misshapen orb, brown and rough, that squats in your palm like something already past its prime. A medlar. Beside it, quinces glow yellow in the branches, their fragrance thick and floral, and mulberries stain the ground purple-black where they've fallen and burst. Forgotten fruits, tangled together, waiting to be remembered. Here's the mainstream fact. Medieval gardens and orchards grew a far wider range of fruits than modern people usually imagine. While apples and pears existed, they were often smaller, tartar, and less sweet than the varieties bred later. Quinces, mulberries, and medlars were common sights, woven into cooking, preserving, and medicine. These were seasonal luxuries, treasured because sugar was rare and imported, so natural sweetness, when it came, was celebrated. The quirky tidbit? Medlars were only edible when bleked, a polite medieval word meaning they had to rot first. You'd pick them hard and inedible, then wait until they softened, brown and mushy, before scooping out their custard-like pulp. Because of this, the fruit earned a reputation for crudeness. Some medieval writers even gave it the nickname open-arse fruit for its resemblance to, well, you can fill in the visual. Yet at feasts, a dish of softened medlars was considered a treat, both indulgent and just a little cheeky. Historians still argue whether quinces were eaten raw at all or exclusively cooked. Some sources suggest the fruit's sharp astringency made it inedible straight from the tree, while others hint that particularly ripe or rare varieties could be enjoyed fresh. What we do know is that quinces were beloved in preserves. Their natural pectin made them perfect for jellies and marmalades. Yes, the very word marmalade comes from the Portuguese for quince paste. So when you spoon jam onto toast today, you're tasting a medieval legacy hidden in plain sight. You pick a quince now, its skin golden but rough, and bring it close. Its scent is intense, perfumed like roses mixed with honey, and though your tongue curls at the thought of biting raw, you can almost imagine it melting into a golden paste after long cooking with honey. Quinces were offered as gifts between nobles, their fragrance seen as a mark of refinement. In one corner of a garden, jars of quince preserves might have lined the shelves, each jar a little treasure against the cold months. Then there are mulberries. You crouch low and taste one, your fingers instantly stained dark. Sweet, tart, juicy, they were loved not just for eating but for their role in sericulture. Silkworms fed exclusively on mulberry leaves, meaning that even a humble orchard could connect Europe to the shimmering luxury of silk. Some monasteries experimented with raising silkworms, hoping to cut out the costly imports from Asia, though with mixed success. Imagine monks in silence, carefully feeding wriggling caterpillars with mulberry leaves, hoping to spin wealth from their cloisters. Beyond these three, other orchard fruits filled medieval tables: damsons, sloes, and even service berries. Each came with its quirks. Damsons, tart little plums, made strong wines and syrups. Sloes, so sour they twisted mouths, were steeped in spirits. Service berries carried a name that confused even medieval folk, straddling the line between sacred use and daily food. Many of these were eaten fresh only in desperation. Most were transformed, cooked, sweetened, fermented, or dried. Preservation was the key, and fruit was often less about instant gratification and more about survival and flavor through the year. As you walk between the trees, the orchard feels alive with smells: fermenting fruit on the ground, honeybees drifting lazily between blossoms, the musky sweetness of overripe quinces. A modern aside: if you walked into a contemporary supermarket with a basket of medlars, sloes, and quinces, you'd probably get puzzled stares. Yet for a medieval gardener, these were as ordinary as apples are for you. It's not that these fruits vanished entirely, but rather they slipped to the margins, eclipsed by the easier, sweeter, prettier imports and breeds that followed. You lean against a mulberry trunk, your fingertips still sticky, and picture a banquet hall in winter. Instead of strawberries out of season, the nobles would have trays of quince paste cut into jeweled squares, bowls of mulled wine steeped with dried damsons, and perhaps a dish of medlars passed down the table with sly grins. Each fruit carried not only taste but memory of the seasons, of gathering, of the earth itself. And here, in the quiet of the orchard, you realize how much of that memory has slipped from modern tongues. The sweetness of mulberries, the perfume of quinces, the dark humor of medlars, all once part of the rhythm of eating, now half ghosts in forgotten gardens. The path narrows into the last stretch of the garden, and you can feel the weight of centuries settling on your shoulders. The neat beds and hedges that guided you earlier give way to a more chaotic sprawl, plants tangling over one another, herbs bolting to seed, fruits falling and left to rot. It feels less like cultivation and more like surrender. This is the season of loss, the slow fading of forgotten vegetables as new arrivals muscled their way into Europe's kitchens. Here's the mainstream fact. The introduction of crops like potatoes, tomatoes, and maize from the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries transformed European diets. Gradually, many of the vegetables you've wandered through tonight lost ground, literally. Peasants chose high-yield potatoes over turnips. Tomatoes displaced sorrel's sour spark. Sugar beets overtook the earthy roots once used for greens. The once vibrant diversity of medieval gardens narrowed, reshaped by trade, empire, and convenience. The quirky tidbit? When the potato first arrived, many Europeans distrusted it, calling it the devil's apple. Some believed it caused leprosy, others that it was an aphrodisiac too dangerous to be planted widely. Yet within a few generations, it became the continent's most vital staple, erasing whole categories of forgotten vegetables by its sheer efficiency. Imagine monks in their cloisters, once carefully tending skirret beds, suddenly abandoning them for potatoes that yielded 10 times the calories. Historians still argue whether this shift was inevitable progress or a tragic narrowing of taste and tradition. Some say Europe gained stability, famines eased, populations grew. Others mourn the loss of biodiversity, the subtle flavors of sorrel stews and medlar preserves fading into memory. Was it survival, or was it cultural amnesia? That question still hangs over every modern plate. You trudge along the overgrown edges, brushing against weeds reclaiming once proud patches. The angelica has gone to seed, its hollow stems rattling in the breeze. The medlars lie soft and ignored beneath their trees, rotting without an eager hand to scoop their pulp. Even the skirret, once sweet as sugar, is choked by nettles. It feels like walking through the ruins of a once bustling city, its streets quiet, its houses crumbled, but its spirit lingering in the air. A modern aside flickers. Today, some gardeners and food historians are reviving these plants, sowing seeds of good King Henry, coaxing sorrel back into soups, planting heritage medlars in orchards. But they remain curiosities, not staples. The potato, the tomato, the carrot bread orange for Dutch pride. These are the rulers now. The forgotten vegetables survive only in pockets, in whispers, in the taste of an old leaf rediscovered. You pause and take one last look back across the garden. The cabbages stand defiant, the rue smells sharp in the wind, and the mulberries drip black juice. Everything seems to sigh, as though knowing its time has passed, but still refusing to vanish completely. Forgotten, yes, but not erased. And now, with the night deepening, let the garden fade around you. The air cools, carrying the faint sense of earth and leaf, of something sweet rotting gently under the trees. Your footsteps grow slower, softer, until you're hardly walking at all, just drifting. The plants blur together in memory. The sharp tang of sorrel, the acrid breath of rue, the sticky sweetness of mulberries on your fingers. They become less like vegetables and more like impressions, fading brushstrokes on a canvas too vast to hold in focus. The walls of the medieval garden melt away, leaving you in a haze of quiet fields and dim stars. You sense the rhythm of seasons passing, the sowing, the tending, the harvesting, the forgetting, all of it looping endlessly, long after the gardeners themselves laid down their tools. Those forgotten vegetables, whether clung to or abandoned, still whisper in the soil, their seeds sleeping, waiting for someone curious enough to plant them again. Breathe in once more. The sharpness of bitter greens softens into a lull. The roots that once fed peasants through famine feel heavy, secure, like anchors to the earth. Even the strange, the sour, the half-rotten medlars carry a sweetness when you let the harshness slip away. So let your mind loosen, as if you too are a seed tucked into cool earth, safe and still. The buzzing of daily thought fades, replaced by the gentle hum of time itself, patient and eternal. The garden closes its gates behind you, but you know you could always find your way back, because forgotten doesn't mean gone. It only means waiting quietly until you're ready to remember again. Sleep now, and let the garden keep watch.